Clara Bennett set the last thing she owned on the counter, her father's silver necklace, and pushed it toward the shopkeeper with a steady hand, though everything inside her was breaking. "This is all I have," she said. "I only want bread." The man lifted it, turned it in the light, and laughed. "Not worth the dust on my floor, miss." The whole store laughed with him. What none of them saw was the tall shadow filling the doorway behind her, a mountain cowboy who had watched cruelty destroy people before, and had swore he never would again. Before we begin, if stories of quiet courage and second chances mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe and stay with Clara all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from tonight? I love seeing just how far these stories travel. The bell over the door of Grady's General Store had rung 100 times that morning, and not once had Silas Grady looked up the way he looked up at Clara Bennett. He knew a desperate woman when he saw one. He'd built half his fortune on them. "Help you, miss," he said, though his tone said the opposite. Clara stood straight. She had learned a long time ago that a woman could carry an empty purse without lowering her head, and she carried it now the way her father had taught her: chin-level, shoulders back, eyes forward. "I need food," she said. "Enough to last a few days. I'll be finding work by then." "Work." Silas set down the cloth he'd been folding. "What kind of work does a woman like you find in Red Hollow?" "Any kind that's honest." A couple of men near the barrels chuckled. Silas smiled at them like a man performing. "Honest?" he repeated. Now that's a word we don't hear much from strangers, especially strangers who came in on the Tuesday stage owing 3 nights at the boarding house. "I paid for those nights." "Widow Calloway says otherwise." "Then Widow Calloway is lying." The store went quiet. Even the flies seemed to still. Silas leaned forward on his knuckles, both hands flat on the counter, and let the silence stretch until it hurt. That was his gift. He knew how to make a person feel small in the space between words. "You want to be careful," he said softly, "calling folks in this town liars. Word travels fast here, faster than you can walk." Clara felt the heat climb her neck. Not shame she refused shame, but something close to it. The old sick feeling of standing in a room full of people who had already decided what she was. She had felt it once before. In another town. In another life. She had promised herself she would never feel it again. And here it was. "I'm not asking for charity," she said. "I have money." "Then show it." She opened her purse. She already knew what was in it. She had counted it 4 times on the stage and 4 more times that morning, and it did not change no matter how many times she counted. She set the coins on the counter. 3 of them. 2 pennies and a nickel. Silas looked at the coins. Then he looked at her. "That'll buy you a stick of licorice and a good laugh," he said. "Not bread." "Then I'll take the licorice." That got a real laugh out of him. Not cruel this time, surprised. He hadn't expected her to have any fight left. Most of them didn't by the time they reached his counter. But the fight only made the game more fun. "Tell you what," he said, straightening. "You seem like a proud woman. I respect a proud woman. So I'll make you a fair deal. You got anything worth trading?" And that was the moment Clara knew what she was going to do and hated it and did it anyway. She reached up and unclasped the silver necklace from her throat. It was a small thing. A thin chain. A locket no bigger than a thumbnail tarnished at the edges where 40 years of thumbs had worried it smooth. It had hung on her mother's neck and her grandmother's before that, and her father had pressed it into Clara's hand the last night she saw him alive and told her, "This is worth more than anything I could ever leave you." Not the silver, what it means. She set it on the counter. She did not let her hand shake. She would not give them that. "This is all I have," she said. "It's real silver. It's worth more than a week of bread." Silas picked it up. He held it to the window. Light turned it, squinted at the clasp, ran a fat thumb over the locket, like a man appraising a horse's teeth. Then he set it back down and slid it toward her with one finger. "Not worth much." The store laughed. Clara's stomach dropped, but her face didn't move. "It's real silver," she said again. Sure it is, and I'm the governor of Montana. He waved a hand at the men by the barrels. Boys, you hear this? She comes in here with 2 pennies and her grandmother's junk, and she wants me to feed her for a week. Feed her something, Silas, one of the men called out, grinning. Feed her some manners. More laughter. A woman by the fabric shelves, a heavy-set woman in Sunday gray, though it was a Thursday, pulled her skirts aside as though Clara's poverty might get on them. There's a word for women who wander into towns with no husband and no money. The woman said, not to Clara, but loud enough for Clara. Martha, Silas said, warning and pleased at once. I'm only saying what's Christian to say. The woman's mouth curled. There's a mission down in Butte. They take that kind. Clara reached out and picked up the necklace. Her fingers closed around it, and for one terrible second, she thought she might cry right there in front of all of them, and she pressed her nails into her own palm, hard enough to leave marks, because she would die before she cried in that room. Thank you for your time, she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that later. However badly the rest of it went, her voice came out even. She turned toward the door. She would rather starve on the road than beg one more coin from people who enjoyed watching her hurt. She had walked out of a town before with nothing but her name half ruined and her spine straight, and she could do it again, and she was already doing the arithmetic of it. How far to the next town? How many miles she could make before dark? How long a body could go without food before the legs gave out? And then a voice came from behind her, low, slow, from the direction of the door. That woman isn't leaving hungry. The laughter stopped, not gradually, all at once like a lamp blown out. Clara turned. He filled the doorway. That was the first thing she noticed, not his face, not his eyes, just how much of the light he took up standing there. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, dust on his boots and dust on his hat. A hat he did not take off, and a face weathered brown as saddle leather by more summers than she could count. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Silas Grady. Ethan, Silas said, and something in his voice had changed. The performing tone was gone. Didn't hear you come in. No, Ethan Walker said. I don't reckon you did. He stepped forward. One step. His boot came down on the floorboards with a sound that seemed too loud for one man. The men by the barrels had gone very interested in their own hands. This here's town business, Silas said, trying to find the ground he'd been standing on a minute ago. Woman came in trying to run a swindle. Old Lockett says it's silver. It's silver, Ethan said. You didn't even look at it. Didn't have to. I heard how she said it. Ethan's gray eyes moved finally to Clara, to the necklace still clutched in her fist, and then back to Silas. A woman lying about a thing don't hold it like that. Clara opened her mouth, closed it. She did not know what to say to a man who had read the truth of her off the grip of her own hand from 30 feet away. Silas laughed, but it came out thin. Now hold on. You gonna take a stranger's word over? I'm not taking anybody's word. Ethan reached into his vest and set a small stack of coins on the counter, and the sound of them was very loud in the quiet. I'm buying the lady her provisions. Flour, salt, coffee, bacon, beans, whatever she needs. And you're going to fill that order like she was any other paying customer walked through your door. Silas looked at the coins. It was more money than Clara's whole purse had ever held. You don't even know her, Silas said. Ethan was quiet a moment. I know enough, he said. And there it was again. 3 words the same, 3. And Clara felt them land somewhere under her ribs, where she hadn't let anything land in a long time. Because for the first time since the stage had let her off in this dust-blown laughing town, somebody had looked at her and seen a person. Not a problem, not a swindle, a person. Silas's jaw worked. He glanced at Martha, at the men by the barrels, at the coins, and Clara watched greed war with pride on his face, and watched greed win the way it always did with men like Silas Grady. Fine, he said, snatching up the money. But I'll say for the record I don't like it. A man ought to know who he's spending on. You've made your record, Ethan said. Now fill the order." Silas turned to the shelves muttering, and began pulling down goods, and for a moment Clara thought that was the end of it, that she would take her sack of provisions and her wounded pride and walk out into the heat and never see this town or this man again. But the woman in gray wasn't finished. "You're a fool, Ethan Walker," Martha said. "Buying food for a woman like that? You know what she is." Ethan turned his head slowly. "No, ma'am," he said. "I don't. Why don't you tell me?" The way he said ma'am was not respect. It was something colder than respect wrapped in the shape of it. Martha's chin lifted. She came in on the Tuesday stage, alone. No husband, no family. Told folks she had work waiting at the schoolhouse, and Reverend Pryor says he never sent for any assistant, never wrote her a letter, never heard her name in his life. So either she's a liar, or she's... "Careful," Ethan said. "Just that. Careful." And Martha stopped because there are men whose quiet is louder than other men shouting, and Ethan Walker was one of them. Clara found her voice. "I have the letter." Every head in the store turned to her. "I have the letter," she said again, and her hands were steady, now steadier than they'd been all morning, because this she could fight. "It's signed. It says the school in Red Hollow needs an assistant to teach the little ones their letters and sums, $40 a season, room provided. It's signed M. Pryor. I still have it. It's in my bag." "Let's see it then," Martha said. Clara opened her travel bag. She dug past the folded blue dress, past the tin cup, past the small wrapped bundle that held everything she owned in the world, and her fingers found the paper worn soft at the folds from being read, and reread, on 100 lonely miles, and she pulled it out and held it up. "Here." Silas reached over the counter and took it before Ethan could. He unfolded it. He read it. And Clara watched his face and saw something flicker across it. Something quick and ugly, and gone almost before it appeared, and her heart dropped because she knew that look. She'd seen it on a man's face once before in another town, the moment before her whole life came apart. "This isn't Reverend Pryor's hand," Silas said. "It is," Clara said. "It's the letter he sent me. It came to my boarding house in Cheyenne 6 weeks ago. Reverend Pryor's been in Red Hollow 11 years. I know his hand like I know my own. This ain't it." Silas held the letter up, and now his voice had found its performing tone again, warm and terrible. "This is a forgery, folks. Woman forged herself a letter to weasel a job that don't exist. That's a lie," Clara said, and heard her own voice crack for the first time, and hated it. "That's a lie. I never—" "You calling me a liar again?" "Somebody's lying," Ethan said. He said it quietly, but it cut clean through the room, and everybody looked at him. He held out his hand toward Silas. "Let me see it." "Ethan." The letter Silas. There was a moment, a long one, where Clara thought Silas might not give it up. His fist tightened on the paper. And then Ethan took one more step forward, and Silas handed it over, the way a man hands over a thing he's afraid of. Ethan unfolded the letter. He read it slowly. Clara watched his gray eyes move down the page, and she realized she was holding her breath, that her whole future had somehow gathered itself into whatever this stranger decided about a folded piece of paper, and she did not know when she had started letting a stranger's judgment matter that much. Ethan looked up. "Reverend Pryor still living out past the church?" he asked. Not to Clara, to the room. "He is," one of the men by the barrels said. "Then this is simple." Ethan folded the letter back along its worn creases, careful with it, gentle, in a way that surprised Clara, and held it out to her. She took it. Her fingers brushed his, and they were rough as bark. "We walk down to the Reverend right now, all of us, and we ask the man himself whether he wrote it." The store went dead silent, and Clara, who had been so afraid, who had been so ready to walk out into the heat and disappear, watched Silas Grady's face go pale. Because a man who's told the truth doesn't fear a witness. Only a man who's lied does. "Now there's no call for that," Silas said, and his voice had lost every bit of its warmth. "The Reverend's an old man, sick. We don't need to go dragging him into a stranger's business over a few pennies of flour." "You dragged him into it," Ethan said. You said he never sent for her. You said her letter's a forgery. That's an accusation. A man makes an accusation, he ought to be willing to walk down the street and prove it." He tilted his head, and there was something almost gentle in it which made it worse. "Unless he can't." The word hung there. Can't. Clara looked from Ethan to Silas and back, and slowly she began to understand that something else was happening in this room, something bigger than her, something that had been happening in Red Hollow before she ever stepped off the stage. "I don't like your tone," Silas said. "I don't much like standing in your store," Ethan answered. "But here we both are." Del Prentice chose that moment to push off the barrel he'd been leaning on. He was a big man, near as big as Ethan, with a red face and a wet mouth, and the kind of loud confidence that comes from never once being told no. He'd been quiet through most of it, watching the way a dog watches a fight. It's deciding whether to join. "You know what your trouble is, Walker," Del said, thumbs in his belt, swaggering forward. "You live up on that mountain by yourself so long you forgot how a town works. Down here folks look after their own. And she," he jerked his chin at Clara without looking at her, "ain't one of ours." "No," Ethan agreed. "She's not, and you've made real sure she knows it." "Damn right. So a woman comes to your town alone with a letter and 40 miles of hope and finds the job's gone and the room's gone and the whole street laughing at her." Ethan's voice never rose. That was the terrible thing about it. It never rose. "And instead of one of you, just one, asking whether maybe she got wronged, you all decided quicker in a jackrabbit that she's a liar and a thief, because it was easier, because it was fun. Now you listen. I've done my listening." Ethan finally turned and looked at Del full on, and Del, for all his size, took half a step back without seeming to know he'd done it. "I listened to the whole thing from that doorway, every word, and I'll tell you what I heard. I heard a room full of grown men and women find real joy in kicking a person who was already down. I've seen that before, Del. I've seen where it ends. And I swore to God and my own 2 hands I'd never stand quiet in a room where it was happening again." Nobody spoke. Clara realized her eyes were wet. She blinked hard, furious at herself, and looked at the floor. "Now," Ethan said, turning back to the counter. "Silas is going to fill this order, because I paid for it and it's bought and done. And then this lady and I are going to walk down the street to Reverend Pryor's nice and slow in front of the whole town, if that's how it's got to be, and we're going to find out the truth. And whoever's been lying." His eyes moved once deliberately across the whole room, touching Silas, touching Martha, touching Del, is going to have to stand in the sunlight and answer for it. The silence held. Then Silas Grady laughed. But it was a broken sort of laugh, the laugh of a man who's lost the room and knows it. "You're gonna regret this, Walker," he said. "Taking a stranger's side against the whole town." "Maybe," Ethan said. "I've regretted worse." He picked up the sack of provisions off the counter. Silas had filled half the order and stopped, and Ethan didn't ask him to finish it, just took what was there, and he held it easy in one big hand and turned to Clara. "Ma'am," he said, and this time the word was soft as anything. He touched the brim of his hat. "You ready?" Clara looked at him. She had known this man for the length of one conversation. She had known this town for 2 days, and every instinct she'd sharpened over a hard year of being wronged and doubted and run out told her to trust nobody to take the food and go to, never again put her fate in a stranger's hands. But he had read the truth off the grip of her fingers. He had believed her over a whole town. He had said, "I know enough," and meant it. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." And she followed Ethan Walker out of Grady's general store and into the white heat of the street, and she did not once look back, though she could feel every eye in that store pressing on her spine like a brand. They walked. Clara had to move quick to keep up with him, though he wasn't hurrying. His legs were just long, and the sack of provisions rode easy on his shoulder like it weighed nothing. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. They'll hold it against you, what that man said about taking my side. They'll hold a lot of things against me." Ethan didn't slow down. "Been holding things against me for years. One more won't tip the scale." Clara looked at him sideways. Up close in the daylight, she could see the gray in his beard and the deep lines fanning from the corners of his eyes, and something else, a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. "Why did you," she asked, "take my side? You don't know me." He was quiet for a few steps. "Because I heard how they laughed," he said finally. "And I know that laugh. I heard it a long time ago in a store, not so different, aimed at somebody who couldn't fight back." His jaw tightened. "Didn't do anything about it that time. Told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself a lot of things." He shifted the sack. "I've had a lot of years to think about what I should have done instead." Clara didn't ask who. She could hear in his voice that she shouldn't. They passed the boarding house. Widow Calloway was on the porch, and she watched them go by with her arms crossed and her mouth pinched tight, and Clara felt the woman's stare and lifted her chin and did not give her the satisfaction of a flinch. "That's the woman who said I never paid," Clara said quietly. "I know it. I did pay. I paid $3 for 3 nights, and she took my money, and this morning she told me my room was let to someone else, and I could sleep in the street for all she cared." "I believe you." 2 words. He said it plainly, like a fact about the weather. "I believe you." And Clara had to look away out at the heat shimmer over the road, because she could not remember the last time somebody had said that to her, and she'd known it was true. "You keep saying that," she said, "that you believe me. Why?" Ethan stopped walking. They were in the middle of the street, and the whole town could see them, and he stopped and turned and looked down at her with those deep gray eyes, and for a moment he seemed to be deciding something. "When my mother was alive," he said, "she used to say a person tells the truth with their whole body, their hands, the set of their shoulders, the way they hold on to a thing that matters." He nodded at her fist she was still gripping. The necklace hadn't put it away, had been holding it the whole time. "You've held on to that locket through the whole thing, through all their laughing. You never once let it go, and you never once tried to sell it cheap just to make them stop. A liar sells the thing. A liar makes the deal. You'd have starved first." His voice roughened. "That's how I knew, ma'am. A body doesn't lie. Only the mouth does." Clara stood in the middle of that dusty street with the sun beating down and a stranger's kindness sitting on her chest like something warm and heavy, and she found she could not speak at all. She looked down at her own hand, at her white knuckles wrapped around her father's necklace. She hadn't even known she was still holding it. "His name was Thomas," she said before she meant to. "My father. He gave me this the night before he died. Said it wasn't worth anything for the silver. Said it was worth everything for what it meant." She swallowed. "So when that man said it wasn't worth much, he was right and he was wrong, and I couldn't—" Her voice broke. She stopped, pressed her lips together, furious again at the treacherous wet in her eyes. Ethan didn't say anything. He didn't tell her not to cry, didn't tell her it would be all right, didn't do any of the useless things people do. He just stood there, big and steady in the heat, and waited, and let her have the moment without trying to fix it. That, more than anything, was what undid her. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes hard with the back of her wrist. I'm not a woman who cries in the street." "No," Ethan said. "I don't reckon you are." He waited until she'd got herself back. Then he tipped his head down the road. "Reverend's just past the church. You want to go clear your name, or you want to keep it clenched up in your fist a while longer." And despite everything, despite the whole ruined morning, despite the laughing store and the pinched-faced landlady and the year of grief behind her, Clara Bennett laughed. It came out cracked and watery, but it was a laugh. "Let's go see the Reverend," she said. Reverend Pryor was old, and he was frail, and he was not sick the way Silas had claimed. He sat on his porch in a cane-backed chair, with a Bible open on his knee, and cloudy blue eyes that watered in the sun, and when Ethan Walker came up his path with a strange young woman beside him, the old man smiled like a man who didn't get many visitors. "Ethan," he said, "come down off your mountain. That's twice this season. Folks'll start to talk." "Let them," Ethan said. "Reverend, this here's Miss Clara Bennett. She's got a question needs answering, and I told her you're the only man in this town who'd give her a straight one." The old reverend turned his cloudy eyes on Clara, and something in his face went still and careful. "Bennett," he said slowly. "Clara Bennett." "Yes, sir." Her heart was pounding. "Reverend, 6 weeks ago, I received a letter. It said the Red Hollow School needed an assistant teacher. It offered me the position. $40 a season and a room. It was signed with your name." She held it out with both hands the way you'd hand over something sacred. "I came all the way from Cheyenne, and when I got here they told me there was no letter. They told me I forged it. Reverend," her voice steadied, "did you write this? Please, I only need the truth." The old man took the letter. He held it far out from his face, then close, then reached into his coat for a pair of spectacles and set them on his nose and read it slowly, his lips moving, and Clara's whole life hung on the moving of an old man's lips. When he finished, he lowered the letter, and his face had gone gray. "I wrote this," he said quietly. Clara's knees nearly went out from under her. "You—" She had to grip the porch rail. "You wrote it. You did write it. 6 weeks ago. To the address in Cheyenne, care of a Miss Bennett, on the recommendation of a friend of mine down there who spoke very highly of your teaching." The Reverend's cloudy eyes lifted, and they were troubled now, deeply troubled. "Child, I have been waiting for you. The children have been without proper letters since Christmas. I don't understand when you didn't arrive on the June stage. I thought you'd changed your mind. I thought you weren't coming." "I came on Tuesday," Clara whispered. "I came on Tuesday, Reverend, 2 days ago." "Tuesday." The old man's face changed. Something hardened in it, something Clara wouldn't have thought that gentle face could hold. "You've been in Red Hollow 2 days, and no one told me. No one came to say the new teacher had arrived." He looked at Ethan. "Silas Grady's boy fetches my mail. Silas keeps the town's letters behind his counter, hands them out as he pleases." The Reverend's jaw trembled with something that was not frailty. "Ethan, what has been done to this girl?" And Ethan Walker, who had stood quiet through the whole of it, finally spoke. "Same as gets done to a lot of folks in this town, Reverend," he said. "By the same man. I reckon it's about time somebody stood in the sunlight and answered for it." The old Reverend closed his Bible. He set it aside, and he reached for his cane, and he pushed himself up out of his chair with a strength that surprised them both, and stood swaying only a little in the full light of the summer sun. "Then help me down these steps, young man," he said, "because I have a walk to take, and a store to visit, and some words to say to Silas Grady that are 40 years overdue." Clara looked at the old man rising. She looked at the cowboy steadying his elbow. She looked at the letter in her own 2 hands, the letter that proved in an old man's failing script that she had not lied, that she had never lied, that everything she'd said was true. And for the first time in more than a year, Clara Bennett felt the ground come solid under her feet. She wasn't a liar. She wasn't trouble. She was a schoolteacher, $40 a season, room provided, sent for, and expected and wanted. And 2 people in this whole cruel town had chosen to believe her before they had one shred of proof, an old preacher and a lonely man off a mountain who'd read the truth off her clenched fist and stepped out of a doorway to change her whole life with 3 plain words. "Miss Bennett," Ethan said. He'd got the Reverend down the first step. He looked back at her, and under the shadow of his hat brim, something in his gray eyes had eased. Not softened exactly, but eased the way ground eases after a long drought when the first rain finally comes. "You coming? I reckon this next part's got your name on it." Clara folded her father's letter along its worn creases. She slid it and the silver necklace safe into her bag. Then she lifted her chin level and steady the way her father had taught her, and she stepped down off the Reverend's porch to walk back up that long dusty street toward the store that had laughed at her this time, with an old man of God on one side and a mountain cowboy on the other, and the truth folded up safe against her heart. "Yes," she said. "I'm coming." The 3 of them made a strange procession up the middle of Red Hollow's main street, an old preacher leaning on his cane, a young woman with her chin held level, and a mountain cowboy who walked slow so the Reverend could keep pace. And the town watched them come. They came out onto their porches. They stopped in the doorways of the feed store and the barber's. Widow Calloway set down her broom. Two boys quit their marbles in the dust and stared. Word had already run ahead of them, the way word does in a small town, faster than a body can walk. And by the time they reached Grady's general store, half of Red Hollow had gathered to see what the Reverend meant by coming down off his hill on a Thursday with the Walker man at his side. Silas Grady stood in the doorway of his store with his arms crossed. "Reverend," he said, and his voice was oil poured over water. "Now this is a surprise. You ought not be out in this heat. Let me send my boy up to fetch you home." "You'll send your boy nowhere," Reverend Pryor said. The old man stopped at the foot of the store steps. He was breathing hard from the walk, but his cloudy eyes had cleared to something sharp, and his voice, when it came, carried out over the whole gathered street. "Silas Grady, did you take a letter from my hand 6 weeks ago, addressed to me from a Miss Clara Bennett of Cheyenne, accepting the position of assistant teacher at this town's school?" The street went quiet. Silas uncrossed his arms. "Reverend, I don't know what this woman's been telling you. That is not what I asked." The old man's cane came down hard on the bottom step. "I asked, did a letter come? I asked, did you keep it? I asked, did you know 2 days ago that the teacher I have been praying for since Christmas walked off the Tuesday stage into this very store, and did you say nothing to me? Now, answer as a man answers before God, Silas, because I am too old to be lied to, and too near my grave to pretend I don't know when I'm being lied to." "Did a letter come?" Clara watched Silas Grady's face. She watched it the way you watch a wall that's begun to crack slow at first, then all at once. He looked at the Reverend. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Ethan Walker standing quiet and enormous at the Reverend's shoulder hat brim. Low, saying nothing, letting the old man do the work. And Silas found for perhaps the first time in his life that there was no room in the street to perform. "Letters come every day," he said. "I can't recall every." "You recall this one," a voice said. It wasn't Clara. It wasn't Ethan. It wasn't the Reverend. It was a boy, maybe 14, thin as a fence rail, standing in the shadow of the store's side wall with a broom in his hands and a look on his face like a boy who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has just decided to set it down. "Danny," Silas said. His voice had gone flat. "Get inside." "You told me to hide it," the boy said. The whole street turned. "Danny!" Silas's face had gone white now, white as the flour on his shelves. "I'm warning you. You told me to hide it, Pa." The boy's chin was shaking, but he kept talking, and once he'd started, he couldn't seem to stop the words coming faster and faster, like water through a broken dam. "The letter come. It come 6 weeks back, and I brought it in with the rest, and you read it, and you said the Reverend didn't need to know. You said we'd tell folks the school teacher never showed you. Said," his voice cracked clean in half, "you said if a stranger woman came asking, we'd run her off before anybody could check. And she came. She came Tuesday, and you knew her the second she said her name, and you—" "That is enough," Silas roared. But it was too late. It was far, far too late, and every soul on that street knew it. And Clara Bennett stood in the dust and felt the whole ruined morning turn over inside her chest and come out the other side as something she hadn't felt in more than a year. Vindication. The Reverend closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. "Why?" the old man said. "Just that. Why Silas, a school teacher? Children who can't read their own names. What in God's earth was worth that?" And here the crack in Silas Grady became a break. And the break became a landslide because a cornered man who's already lost stops guarding his tongue. "You want to know why?" Silas came down one step, jabbing a finger at the Reverend, at the crowd, at the whole town. "Because that school sits on the North Acre, and the North Acre backs up against the creek, and come next spring the railroad survey comes through, and any fool with eyes can see the depots going where the creek meets the road. You want a schoolhouse full of brats squatting on the most valuable dirt in this territory. I've got plans for that land. Plans that don't include $40 teachers and a preacher too blind to know what he's sitting on." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard. Ethan Walker shifted his weight. It was the first time he'd moved in minutes. "The railroad," Ethan said quietly. "That's right, the railroad." Silas was past caution now, past sense his ruin, loosening his tongue completely. "Same railroad that's going to make some men in this town rich and leave the rest of you scratching. And I mean to be on the right side of it. So yes, I buried the letter. I'd bury 100 letters. What's one stray woman against—" He stopped. Because Ethan Walker had taken one step forward, and Silas Grady stopped talking the way a man stops talking when the ground he thought was solid turns out to be air. "You said the railroad's going where the creek meets the road," Ethan said. His voice hadn't risen. It never rose. But something new had come into it, and Clara felt the hair stand up on her arms. "That's the North Acre. School sits on the North Acre. And the North Acre's not the only thing that backs up to that creek, is it, Silas?" Silas's mouth worked. No sound came out. "My East Range backs up to that creek," Ethan said. "The Hendricks place backs up to that creek. Widow Calloway's back 40 backs up to that creek. Half the small holdings on the north side of this valley touch that water somewhere." He tilted his head. "You've known where that depot's going for months. And what have you been doing about it, Silas? What's a man do when he knows land's about to be worth 10 times what folks paid for it? And he's got a store where every rancher in the valley runs a line of credit." The street had gone so still Clara could hear her own heart. "You've been calling in debts?" Ethan said softly. "Haven't you? Squeezing the smallholders? Buying up creek land for pennies off men too broke to know what they're selling. You ran that woman out of your store this morning the same way you've been running folks off their land all year, because it's what you do. It's the only thing you know how to do." His gray eyes had gone cold as a January creek. "Kick a person while they're down and take what they can't hold on to." And Clara, standing there in her worn blue dress with her father's necklace in her bag, and the whole town watching, understood finally what she had walked into. She'd thought this was about her. A stranger wronged, defended. It wasn't about her at all. She was just the loose thread. And Ethan Walker had pulled it, and the whole rotten thing had begun to come apart in the sun. "You've got no proof of any of that," Silas said. But his voice had lost everything now. It was the voice of a man reciting words he doesn't believe. "No," Ethan agreed. "I've got no proof, yet." He turned slow and looked at the crowd. Really looked at them face by face, the way he'd looked at the store an hour before. "But there's a lot of folks standing on this street right now who've had a note called in this year, or a debt reckoned higher than they remembered owing, or a piece of land they somehow couldn't afford to keep. And every one of you told yourself it was just bad luck, just the way things go." He let that sit. "Maybe it's time some of you started asking whether it was luck at all." Nobody moved. And then at the back of the crowd, an old rancher named Hendricks, a stooped man Clara had never seen in a hat gone shapeless with age, said in a voice like gravel, "He took my Southfield in April, said I owed $90. I never owed $90 in my life. He raised my flour 4 cents the week after my husband passed," Widow Calloway said, and her pinched face had come apart into something bewildered and furious. "Said it was the times. Everybody else's flour stayed the same. He's got my son's wages held against a debt I can't make sense of," said a woman with a baby on her hip. "I've been trying to reason it out for a month." The voices came one after another, now low-rising, a murmur turning to a rumble, and Silas Grady stood on the steps of his own store and watched his town turn its face toward him and see him for the first time clearly. Clara looked at Ethan. He wasn't watching Silas anymore. He was watching the crowd, and there was something on his weathered face she couldn't quite name, not triumph. Something sadder and older than triumph. "I didn't do this to ruin you, Grady," Ethan said, and now his voice had gone quiet again, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than anger. "I did it because a woman walked into your store this morning with 2 pennies and her father's necklace, and you laughed at her. And I've spent a long time up on my mountain telling myself the cruelty in this valley wasn't my business, that I'd done my part just by staying out of it." He shook his head slowly. "Turns out staying out of it is how men like you get to do what you do." So, here's the end of my quiet Silas. Right here. Today. The Reverend put his hand on Ethan's arm. That's enough, son, the old man said softly. Let it be enough. The truth's out. Let the town carry it from here. Ethan looked down at the old man's hand on his sleeve. Something in his shoulders eased. Yes, Reverend, he said. Then he turned to Clara. Miss Bennett, he said, you've got a job. Reverend Pryor sent for you. The Reverend wants you, and I reckon there's not a soul on this street that dare say otherwise now. He touched his hat. The Reverend'll want to speak with you about the school, and the room he promised. That's town business, and it's good business, and you earned every bit of it. Clara opened her mouth to thank him, but something in his voice, some door already closing, stopped her. Because Ethan Walker had said, you've got a job. He'd said the Reverend wants you. He'd sorted out her whole future in a handful of words. And then he'd taken half a step back, the way a man steps back from a fire he's finished tending, and Clara understood that he meant to leave. That he'd done what he came to do. And now, he meant to go back up his mountain and never see her again. And Clara Bennett, who had spent a year learning to need nobody, felt something in her chest lurch at the thought of it. Wait, she said. Ethan stopped. The room, she said. Her mind was moving fast now, faster than her pride. The Reverend said the room was the rooms at the boarding house, isn't it? Widow Calloway's boarding house. The same boarding house that put me out in the street this morning and swore I never paid. Widow Calloway at the edge of the crowd went red. Now there was a misunderstanding, the widow began. There was no misunderstanding, Clara said, and she was surprised at how steady her voice came now, how the morning's fear had burned clean away and left something harder underneath. You took my $3 and you gave my room to someone else, and when I asked for it back, you told me to sleep in the street. And now the Reverend tells me that room was mine by promise before I ever set foot in this town. She turned to the Reverend. Isn't that so? It is, the old man said. The room was part of the position. I arranged it with Mrs. Calloway myself, in the spring. So you knew, Clara said to the widow. You knew a teacher was coming. You knew a room was held. And when I came asking for it, you pretended you'd never heard of me and turned me into the street. The widow's mouth opened and shut, and Clara understood something else then, that Widow Calloway hadn't acted alone either. That the same hand that buried the letter had leaned on the landlady too. That the whole town had been a web, and Silas Grady the spider at its center, and everybody had done their small cruel part because it was easier than asking questions. I don't want the room, Clara said. The word surprised even her. I don't want it, she said again, and now she was sure. I won't sleep under the roof of a woman who put me in the street and lied about it. I won't drink her coffee or eat at her table or say good morning to her on the stairs. I'd rather sleep on the schoolhouse floor. Now, child, the Reverend began, you can't sleep in the school. There's no... She'll stay at my ranch. The words came from Ethan. Every head on the street turned. Clara turned. Even Ethan himself looked faintly surprised, as if the words had come out ahead of his thinking. Ethan Walker. Widow Calloway breathed, scandalized. An unmarried woman. Alone. At a bachelor's ranch. Why the talk? The talk, Ethan repeated. He looked around the street slow, and the coldness had come back into his voice. Y'all have done a lot of talking today. Talked a woman into the dust. Talked yourselves into believing a lie because it was easy. So I don't reckon I'll be taking any lessons on talk from this town. He turned to the Reverend. Reverend, my mother's people are gone, but my mother's house still stands, and it's got 2 rooms and a lock on the door of each. There's a woman who worked my kitchen when I was a boy, old Ruth down the valley, who'd come stay as chaperone for $1 a week and be glad of the wages. It'd be respectable, and it'd be safe, which is more than this town's offered the lady so far. The Reverend studied Ethan's face for a long moment. Then the old man smiled a small, tired, knowing smile, the smile of a man who has married and buried half a valley and knows the human heart better than the human heart knows itself. That would be respectable, the Reverend agreed. And Ruth's a good Christian woman. I'd trust the arrangement. His cloudy eyes moved to Clara. "If Miss Bennett's willing." Clara looked at Ethan Walker. She looked at the man who had stepped out of a doorway and changed her whole morning with 3 words. Who had walked an old preacher down a hot street to clear her name. Who had pulled one loose thread and unraveled a corruption that had been strangling this valley for a year. Who had 10 seconds ago offered her his dead mother's house before he'd even finished deciding to. Every instinct she'd sharpened over a hard year told her to say no, to take the job and the school and stand on her own 2 feet and owe no man anything. She had learned the hard way what it cost a woman to lean on somebody. But she looked at his face, at the tiredness in it, at the deep lines around his eyes, at the way he was already half-braced for her to refuse, as if refusal was the thing he expected from the world, and she thought of what he'd said in the middle of the street. A liar sells the thing. A liar makes the deal. You'd have starved first. He'd believed her, before anyone, before there was any reason to. "I'm willing," Clara said, and something in Ethan Walker's shoulders, some tightness she hadn't even noticed until it let go, eased. "All right," he said. He touched his hat again. "Then let's get you out of this town, ma'am. I've had about all the fellowship I can stand for one day." He shouldered the sack of provisions, and he turned and Clara fell in beside him, and the 2 of them walked away up the street toward the north road, away from the store, away from the crowd, away from the whole rotten little town. And behind them, the Reverend's voice rose thin and strong in the summer air, telling Silas Grady that there'd be a reckoning, that the circuit judge came through in September, that a man who'd cheat a valley would answer for it before the law. But Clara didn't look back. She walked north beside the mountain Cowboy into the long green climb of the valley, and she did not look back once. The ranch sat high up the valley where the road gave out and became a track, and the track gave out and became a memory of a track. And by the time they reached it, the sun had swung far over into afternoon, and Clara's feet ached in her boots, and she had learned 3 things about Ethan Walker. The first was that he did not fill silence. Most people walking 2 hours beside a stranger would talk to keep the quiet away. Ethan didn't. He walked, and he let the quiet sit, and after the first uncomfortable stretch, Clara found she didn't mind it, that it was in fact the most restful thing that had happened to her in a year. He wasn't waiting for her to entertain him. He wasn't measuring her. He was just walking and letting her walk, and the silence between them wasn't empty. It was easy. The second thing was that he watched the land the way other men watch a room full of enemies constantly, without seeming to his gray eyes, moving over the ridgeline and the tree line and the sky. Once he stopped, put out a hand to still her, and stood listening to nothing she could hear for a full half-minute before he lowered his hand and walked on. When she asked what it was, he said, "Nothing. Thought I heard a horse where there oughtn't be one." He didn't explain further, but he checked over his shoulder twice more before they reached the ranch. And the third thing she learned was that this man who had walked into a store and dominated a whole town without raising his voice was afraid of something. She learned it when they came up over the last rise, and the house came into view, a low log house well built with a stone chimney, and a wide porch and a barn behind it, and past the barn a wide flat stretch of ground that had once unmistakably been a garden. Rows still showed under the weeds. A fence still stood half-fallen. And Ethan stopped at the top of the rise and looked down at it all, and something crossed his face quick and raw and gone that Clara had not seen on him even in the worst of the confrontation in town. "That's it," he said. "It's not much." "It's beautiful," Clara said, and meant it. Ethan made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was, once. He didn't say more. He led her down the last of the slope and up onto the porch and pushed open the door of the house. It wasn't locked, she noticed. Nothing this far up needed locking, and stood back to let her enter first. And Clara stepped into Ethan Walker's home and understood at once everything he hadn't said. It was a house that a family had lived in, and a house that one man had been dying in slowly for a long time. The main room held a fine stone hearth and good furniture, built by careful hands, and a woman's touch was everywhere in the bones of it, in the shape of the shelves. The curtains gone gray with dust. a rocking chair set by the fire. But nothing had been tended. Nothing had been loved. A single plate sat washed by the basin. A single cup. A single chair had been pulled up to the great table where 6 might have sat, and the other 5 chairs stood pushed in untouched gathering dust, as if the man who lived here couldn't bear to move them and couldn't bear to use them. Clara stood in the doorway and felt her throat go tight. "You live here alone," she said. "Have for a while." "How long is a while?" Ethan set the provisions down on the great table. He was quiet for a moment, his back to her. 6 years, he said. Clara didn't say anything. She'd learned in the last few hours that this man told the truth in his own time, and that pushing him only made him close. So she waited, and after a moment he said, still not turning around, "It was my folks' place. My father built it. My mother made it a home. I grew up in this house, me and my sister both." His hand rested flat on the tabletop. "Sarah, my sister. She was younger than me by 4 years. Married a man from down the valley, moved off to his place, had a little girl." His voice had gone very even, the way a voice goes, even when a man is holding it together by main force. 6 years back we had a winter. You don't know Montana winters coming from Cheyenne, but this one was the kind old folks name, the kind they tell stories about after. He drew a breath. "My mother took sick in the middle of it, lung fever, and my father set out for the doctor down valley in it, against my saying not to because he wouldn't sit and watch her go without trying." His hand had curled slowly into a fist on the tabletop. "They found him a mile from the doctor's door. Froze. He never made it. And my mother—" He stopped. "My mother went 3 days later, never knowing he'd died trying to save her. That's the one mercy in it. She died thinking he was coming." "Ethan," Clara said softly. "I'm not finished," he said, still level, still not turning around. "Because the worst of it's not that. The worst of it is, I could have gone. I was younger, I was stronger. I knew the trail better than my father ever did. I told him to let me go, and he wouldn't hear it. Said a son doesn't watch his father sit while his mother dies, said it was his to do. And I let him. I stood in that doorway, and I watched my father walk out into a storm I knew would kill him, and I let him because I didn't want to fight him. Because it was easier to stand quiet." His voice cracked just barely on the last word. "That's twice now I've told you about standing quiet, ma'am. In town and here. It's the same sickness. It's the thing I've been trying to bleach out of myself for 6 years. And I hadn't managed it. Not once. Not till I stood in that store this morning and heard them laugh at you and something in me finally said no. Not again. Not this time." The room was very quiet. Clara crossed it. She didn't think about it. She crossed the room and she stood beside him at the table, and she didn't touch him because she sensed he wouldn't want to be touched. But she stood close enough that he'd know she was there. "And your sister?" she asked gently. "Sarah. You said she moved down the valley. Is she—" Ethan turned his head and looked at her, and Clara saw in his gray eyes that she'd stepped on the very worst of it. That everything before had just been the road leading to this. "Sarah's alive," he said. "Sarah's down in the valley right now, 2 miles from that store we stood in this morning." Then, Clara didn't understand. "Then why do you live up here alone? Why don't you—" Because 6 years ago, in that same winter, Sarah's husband did what a lot of men do when times get hard and a store's willing to loan against next spring. Ethan's jaw was tight. He ran a line of credit at Grady's to feed his family through the storm, and when spring came and the debt came due and he couldn't pay it, he stopped. "You've heard the shape of this story already today, ma'am. You heard a dozen versions of it on that street." Clara's blood went cold. "Grady," she said. "Silas Grady took your sister's land, took the land, took the house, took Sarah's husband's pride, which was the thing that broke him. He took to drink, and then he took to leaving, and last I heard he'd gone north to the mines and not come back. Left Sarah and my niece in a rented room in town, taking and washing one step ahead of nothing. Ethan's fist opened and closed on the tabletop. And here's the part I've never said out loud to a living soul. Are you listening, Miss Bennett? Because I want you to hear it, and I don't know why, except that you told me about your father's necklace in the middle of the street, and I reckon a truth for a truth is only fair. I'm listening, Clara whispered. When it happened, when Grady took Sarah's place, I could have stopped it. Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper now, and it shook. I had money. My folks left me this ranch free and clear, and a strongbox with enough in it to have paid off Sarah's debt 3 times over. All she had to do was ask. All I had to do was offer. And I did neither. His eyes had gone bright and wet. Because I was drowning, Clara. My mother and father had been dead a year, and I couldn't get out of bed some days, and I told myself Sarah had a husband to look after her, that it wasn't my place, that a man doesn't go meddling in his sister's marriage. And I stood quiet, again. And by the time I came up out of my own grief enough to see what was happening, it was done. The land was gone. Her husband was gone. And Sarah... His voice failed him completely. He had to stop and breathe. Sarah looked at me and said, "Where were you, Ethan?" Just that. Where were you? And I didn't have an answer. I've never had an answer. And she's never once asked me for anything again, and I've never once had the courage to go down that hill and offer, because every time I try, I hear her say it. Where were you? And I can't face her knowing the answer is, I was right here, 2 miles away, with a strong box full of money, standing quiet. The confession hung in the air between them, and Clara understood now all of it. The single plate. The 5 untouched chairs, the garden gone to weeds. A man who had lost his mother and father to a storm, and lost his sister to his own silence, and who had climbed up onto this mountain 6 years ago to punish himself with solitude, and had been serving that sentence ever since. He hadn't defended her this morning because he was a hero. He'd defended her because she was the debt he'd been unable to pay for. 6 years walked into a store and sat down on a counter with 2 pennies and a necklace. And this one time, he'd found he couldn't stand quiet. Ethan Walker, Clara said. He wouldn't look at her. Ma'am? Look at me. He looked at her. You did not kill your father, she said, quiet and fierce. A storm did. You did not kill your mother. A fever did. And you did not take your sister's land. A cruel man with a ledger did the same man who buried my letter and laughed at me over my father's necklace this morning. You have spent 6 years up on this mountain carrying 3 deaths and a ruin that were never yours to carry, and I will not sit in your mother's house and let you keep carrying them. Her own voice shook now. You want to talk about standing quiet? You didn't stand quiet this morning. I was the one in that store. I was the one with the empty purse and the whole town laughing. And a man stepped out of a doorway and said that woman isn't leaving hungry. That's not a man who stands quiet, Ethan. That's the bravest thing anybody's done for me in my whole life, and you did it for a stranger. Ethan's jaw worked. It was easy to do it for you, he said hoarsely. You were a stranger. I didn't. There was nothing to lose. It's the ones you love. You can't. Then go to her. Ethan went still. Go to Sarah, Clara said. Not today. Not with the whole town watching your ruin of Grady. But soon. Go down that hill and knock on her door and say the thing you just said to me. Say where I was wrong, and I'm sorry. And I've got a strong box and a ranch and 2 hands, and everything I have is yours and your daughter's, and it always was, and I was too broken to say so. Clara's eyes were streaming now, and she didn't care. You saved a stranger this morning, Ethan. A man who can do that can save his own sister. He just has to be braver about the people he loves than the people he doesn't. And I think you're finally ready to be. Ethan Walker stared at her. And for a long, long moment, Clara thought she'd gone too far. That she'd reached into the rawest wound a man had and pressed, and that he'd close up now and send her to her room and go back to being the ghost that haunted this house. But instead, he sat down. slowly, heavily in the single chair pulled up to the great table, and he put his face in his rough hands, and his shoulders shook once hard and then went still. And when he lifted his head, his eyes were wet. But there was something in them Clara hadn't seen before. Not peace. It was too soon for peace, but the beginning of it. "You've known me half a day," he said roughly. "I know," Clara said, "and you're already meddling in my family." "I know that too." She almost smiled. "I'm told I have a habit of it. It's part of why I make a good school teacher, and part of why I've been run out of 2 towns. That surprised a real sound out of him. Half a laugh, cracked and rusty like a hinge that hadn't moved in years. 2 towns, he said. "The first one's a longer story than yours," Clara said. "And it's not for today. Today's yours." She wiped her eyes and straightened. "Now, you said there was a woman down the valley, old Ruth, the chaperone." Ethan cleared his throat, gathering himself. "There is. I'll ride down and fetch her tomorrow. She'll come." "Good," Clara said, "because I'm not leaving." She looked around the dusty, aching, beautiful house at the 5 untouched chairs, the graying curtains, the cold hearth, and something settled in her chest, something that felt absurdly after the worst morning of her life, almost like coming home. "I've got a school to run come Monday, and a room in this town I'll never set foot in, and a man up on a mountain who's been standing quiet for 6 years and has just decided to stop." She lifted her chin, level and steady. "That garden out back was a good garden once. I can see the bones of it. Ethan, I grew up on my father's kitchen plot, and I know how to bring a dead garden back. Give me a season. Give me till the first frost, and I'll show you." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, and he crossed to the great table, and he pulled out one of the 5 untouched chairs, the dust rising off it in a little cloud, and he set it beside his own. He didn't say anything. But it was, Clara understood, the loudest thing he could have said. She sat down in it, and the 2 of them sat there together at a table built for 6, as the long summer afternoon poured gold through the dusty windows, and for the first time in 6 years, there were 2 plates at Ethan Walker's supper. Old Ruth came the next day, just as Ethan had promised, riding up the valley on a gray mule with her whole life in 2 carpet bags and an opinion about everything. She was 70, if she was a day brown and wrinkled as a walnut, sharp-eyed, sharper-tongued. And she took one look at Clara Bennett standing on the porch and said, "So you're the one that finally got him down off this hill and into that town to raise Cain. I heard about it before I heard your name. Whole valley's talking." She swung down off the mule with the ease of a woman half her age. "Silas Grady locked his store this morning and won't come out. Reverend's got a delegation forming to write the territorial judge. And they're saying a mountain cowboy did it Ethan Walker of all the hermits in Montana over a school teacher with 2 pennies to her name." Ruth looked Clara up and down. "You don't look like enough trouble to start a war." "I've been told I don't," Clara said. "It seems to surprise people." Ruth barked a laugh. "I like her," she announced to Ethan, who'd come out onto the porch. "You keep this one." Then, catching herself, she added, "For a chaperone. That's all I meant. Chaperone." "That's all any of us meant," Ethan said dryly, and took her bags. And so, the household of the mountain ranch became 3, and the days took on a shape they had not had in 6 years. Ruth cleaned. She flung open every window in the dead house and beat the dust out of the graying curtains, and scrubbed the neglected floors, until the good wood shone again, muttering the whole time about men who lived like ghosts. She cooked real cooking, 3 plates now, meat and bread and coffee, and she made Ethan sit at the table and eat it. And when he tried to take his plate off to eat alone by the fire, the way he'd done for 6 years, she rapped his knuckles with a wooden spoon and told him a Christian family ate at a table like Christians. And he sat back down, looking so startled that Clara had to turn away to hide her smile. And Clara worked the garden. She was out there at first light every morning before the school day, on her knees, in the dirt, in an old pair of Ethan's mother's work gloves that Ruth had dug out of a trunk. She pulled the weeds, first 6 years of them, some grown into small trees, and hauled them off by the armload until her back ached and her hands blistered through the gloves. Then she found the old rose underneath, still there, still true, laid out by a careful hand long ago. She found the remains of a herb bed gone wild, mint run, rampant sage grown woody. A rosemary bush somehow survived 6 winters of neglect, and beneath the choke of weeds she found good black earth, rested and rich, the finest growing dirt she'd ever put her hands in. "Your mother laid this out," she told Ethan one evening, scrubbing the dirt from under her nails at the basin. Whoever planned this garden knew what she was doing. The herbs on the north, where they'd catch the morning sun. The vegetables staggered so the tall ones wouldn't shade the low. The whole thing set to drain toward the creek so it'd never flood or dry. This wasn't a woman who dabbled, Ethan. This was a woman who knew. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "She grew herbs to sell," he said finally. "Down the valley. Medicinals mostly. She had a knack for it, healing things. Folks used to ride up from the whole territory for my mother's tinctures. Fever remedies. Poultices. She kept a book of it. Every plant, every use, every recipe her own mother taught her and her mother before that." His voice had gone soft. "After she died, I couldn't look at the garden. Couldn't look at the book. I put it away. You still have it?" Clara turned. "The book?" "Somewhere, in her trunk." "Ethan." Clara set down the towel. "Do you know what that's worth? A book of tested remedies, generations of them in a territory 3 days from the nearest doctor. People don't ride up here for tinctures because your mother dabbled. They rode up because she was the closest thing to a physician this valley had. And that knowledge is sitting in a trunk gathering dust while people down that hill are sick and can't afford a 3-day ride to Butte." She was moving now, thinking fast, the way she'd thought in the middle of the street the day before. "The garden's already half yours again. Give me the book. Give me the season. I'll learn every recipe in it. And come fall, we won't just have a garden, Ethan. We'll have your mother's whole practice. Alive again, working again, helping folks again." Her eyes were bright. "It's the best answer there is to a man like Silas Grady. He tears things down for money. We'll build something up that money can't buy." Ethan Walker looked at her across his mother's clean-scrubbed kitchen, and something moved in his weathered face that Clara was coming to recognize, the look of a man watching a light come on in a room that had been dark so long he'd forgotten it had windows. "You'd do that," he said. "Learn my mother's book. Bring back her garden, for folks who've got nothing to give you for it." "I've been the person with nothing to give," Clara said quietly. 2 days ago, in a store with a necklace on a counter. A man could have laughed at me and let me walk out into the heat." She held his gaze. "He didn't. So yes, Ethan, I'd do that. I know exactly what it's worth." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he went to the corner of the room, where a cedar trunk sat under a window, untouched for 6 years, and he knelt in front of it, and he rested his hand on the lid a moment, the way a man rests his hand on a headstone. And then he opened it. The smell of cedar and dried herbs rose up out of it, 6 years shut away. And Ethan reached in past folded quilts and a woman's Sunday dress and lifted out a book, a fat-worn leather-bound book, its pages swollen with pressed leaves and its spine cracked from a lifetime of use. He stood, he turned, and he crossed the room and put his mother's book into Clara Bennett's hands. "Bring it back," he said, and his voice was thick. "All of it. The garden, the book, her, bring it back, Clara. I've been letting it die for 6 years because I didn't have the heart. You've got heart enough for both of us." Clara took the book. It was heavier than she expected, dense with 100 years of a family's careful love. And she held it against her chest, the way she held her father's necklace, and she looked up at the man who'd handed it to her. "I'll bring it back," she promised. "Every bit of it." And she meant it with her whole heart. The days ran into weeks, and the weeks were the best of Clara Bennett's life, and she knew it, even as she was living them, which is a rare and precious thing. She taught the valley's children in the mornings, 9 of them ranging from a 6-year-old who couldn't yet hold a slate pencil to a boy of 13 who worked his father's fields and could only come when the work allowed. She was good at it. She'd always been good at it. And the town that had laughed at her 2 weeks before began grudgingly, and then not so grudgingly, to see it, that the strange woman from Cheyenne had a gift that their children came home able to read, where they'd been ignorant that she'd turned the neglected schoolhouse into a place children actually wanted to go. And in the afternoons and evenings, she worked the garden and studied the book. It came alive under her hands, both of them. The garden greened. The rows she'd cleared filled in beans and squash and greens, and the herb beds, thick and fragrant, and the rosemary that had somehow survived, now joined by a dozen of its neighbors, coaxed back from the dead. And the book gave up its secrets one by one: fever remedies and cough syrups, a poultice for wounds, and a tincture for the ague. Page after page in a fine, slanted hand that Clara came to feel she knew a woman she'd never met, teaching her across the gulf of 6 years and death itself. And Ethan changed. That was the thing Clara watched most closely and treasured most. Ethan Walker changed. The man who'd lived 6 years with 1 plate and 5 untouched chairs began slowly to come back to life alongside his mother's garden. He mended the fallen fence without being asked. He carried water for the herb beds in the dry stretches. He started sitting on the porch in the evenings while Clara studied the book by lamplight. And though he rarely said much, he was there, and his being there filled the house in a way 6 years of solitude had emptied it. One evening he watched her puzzle over a page, a remedy she couldn't make sense of. The ink faded and a leaf pressed over half the words, and without a word he leaned over her shoulder and looked. "That's the winter cough syrup," he said. "Wild cherry bark honey, and that word you can't read, that's whorehound. She grew it down at the far end. It'll have gone wild, but it'll still be there. She swore by it." He was quiet a moment. "I was a boy. I used to grind the bark for her. She'd let me lick the honey spoon after." His voice caught. "I hadn't thought of that in 20 years. "Ethan," Clara said gently, "you remember it. All of it. It's not just in the book. It's in you." "Guess it is." He straightened, but he didn't move away. He stood there behind her chair in the lamplight close, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the not saying was full of something that had been growing between them for 2 weeks now, quiet and unhurried as the garden itself. Then Ruth's voice came from inside the house. "You two done making moon eyes at that book Supper's Cold, and I'm not warming it twice." And the moment broke, and Ethan cleared his throat and stepped back, and Clara laughed and rose, and they went into supper. But she'd felt it. He'd felt it too. And they both knew the other had felt it. It was 3 weeks to the day after Clara had first walked into Grady's store that the thing they'd both been not saying almost got said. They were in the garden at dusk. The school day was long done, and supper was hours off, and Clara was showing Ethan the whorehound bed she'd found and cleared proof of his own memory. The plants his mother had grown, coaxed back from the wild, and Ethan had gone quiet in the particular way she'd learned meant he was working up to something. "Clara," he said. "I went down the hill today." She turned. "To town. Past town. 2 miles past." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the whorehound, at the garden, at the mountain, going gold in the evening light. "To Sarah's." Clara's breath caught. "I knocked on my sister's door," Ethan said for the first time in 6 years, "and I said the thing you told me to say. All of it. Where I was wrong. And I'm sorry. And everything I have is hers and her girls and always was, and I was too broke in my own heart to say it." His voice had gone rough. "And she?" "Ethan." Clara's hand found his arm. "What did she say?" And Ethan Walker turned to look at Clara Bennett, and there were tears standing in his gray eyes. But he was smiling, the first full smile she'd seen on his face in all their weeks together. A smile that took 20 years off him, and he opened his mouth to tell her what his sister had said. And that was when the sound came up the valley. Hooves. Many of them. Fast. Ethan's head snapped around, and the smile died on his face, and he had Clara by the arm and half behind him before she'd even registered the change in him. The mountain man, the watchful one, the one who checked over his shoulder for horses where horses oughtn't be. Down the track, riding hard in the failing light, came a knot of horsemen. 6 of them. 7. Men from town. Clara knew the shapes of them now, knew the red-faced bulk of Del Prentice at the front of them, and they were riding up the mountain toward the ranch with the last of the daylight behind them. And even from here, even across the distance, Clara could see that Del Prentice was holding something in his raised fist. A paper. He was waving a paper over his head as he rode the way a man waves a warrant or a writ or a thing that gives cruelty the shape of law. And beside her, Clara felt Ethan Walker go absolutely still. "Get in the house," he said quietly. "Get Ruth. Bar the door." "Ethan." "Clara." He turned and looked at her, and his gray eyes were flat and cold, as she'd seen them in the store. "Please, get in the house." But Clara Bennett did not move toward the house. She stepped up beside him instead, and she lifted her chin level and steady the way her father had taught her, and she watched the riders come. The riders came up the last of the track and reined in hard at the edge of the garden, and their horses blew and stamped, and for a moment nobody said anything. Then Del Prentice walked his horse forward 2 steps, still holding that paper over his head, and he grinned down at Ethan Walker like a man who'd waited a long time for this. "Evening, Walker," Del said. "Fine little farm you got here. Be a shame if something happened to it." "You're on my land, Del," Ethan said. His voice was level. His body was not. Clara could see it the way he'd shifted his weight, the way one hand hung loose and ready near his hip. "6 of you rode 2 miles up a mountain at dusk. That's not a friendly hour to call." "Oh, this is friendly." Del walked his horse another step. "This is downright neighborly. See, I come all this way to do you a kindness, to let you know man to man before the marshal does it official." He lowered the paper at last and held it out and let it dangle between 2 fat fingers. "You're harboring a thief Walker and a fugitive, and I got the paper says so." Clara felt her stomach drop. "I don't know what game you're—" Ethan started. "No game." Del's grin widened. "This here's a bill of complaint, sworn out this very afternoon before witnesses and carried by a rider come up special from down south. Turns out your little schoolteacher's got a past Walker. Turns out the reason she left her last town wasn't hard luck." He turned in his saddle and raised his voice so it carried so all 6 of his men could hear, so Clara could hear, so it would carry into the very house behind them. "Miss Clara Bennett is wanted in Cheyenne for theft from the very school she taught at. Stole the term's tuition money, near $200, right out of the strongbox and lit out one night before anybody was the wiser." The words hit Clara like cold water. For one terrible second the whole world tilted, because she knew this lie. She knew it. The way an old scar knew its exact shape and weight, and she had run 400 miles to get away from it. And here it was, come up a mountain, after her in the dusk. "That's a lie," she said. Her voice came out thin. She hated how thin it came out. "That's not— I never took a penny. I was blamed for it. I was blamed, and I couldn't prove otherwise, and I left before they could—" "Before they could hang you for it," Del said pleasantly. "Yeah, that's how it usually goes." He looked at Ethan. "So here's your kindness, Walker. Here's the neighborly part. You hand her over. Right now. Quiet. And when the marshal comes up this hill tomorrow with a warrant, I'll tell him you gave her up the second you learned the truth, that you're an honest man, got fooled by a pretty face. And nobody has to know you spent 3 weeks harboring a thief under your roof. Nobody has to know you humiliated the whole town over a woman who's wanted for stealing." He spread his hands. "That's fair. That's more than fair. That's mercy." And Clara understood then exactly what this was. This wasn't the law. This was Silas Grady. This was a cornered man, 3 weeks ruined. His store shuttered, and his valley turned against him, and a territorial judge coming in September. And he'd reached down into the mud of her past and pulled up the one weapon that could turn the whole thing back around. Discredit the woman, and you discredit the man who defended her. Make Clara a thief, and Ethan Walker isn't the valley's conscience anymore. He's a fool who was played, and Silas is the wronged party, and the whole reckoning comes undone. She could see it working already. She could see it in the faces of the men behind Dell, men from the town, men who'd cheered Ethan 3 weeks ago and who now looked at her with the old ugly doubt creeping back in. Because a lie about a stranger is easy to believe. It always had been. That was the whole horror of her life. "Ethan," she said low, only for him. "Don't. Whatever they say, just let me—" "Quiet, Clara," Ethan said. Not unkind, but absolute. He hadn't taken his eyes off Dell. "Let me see the paper," Ethan said. "You don't need to see the—" "Let me see the paper, Dell." Ethan took a step forward, and Clara saw the men behind Dell tense, saw a couple of hands drift toward saddle guns, and her heart climbed into her throat. "You rode up here waving it like it's scripture, so let me read it. Unless there's a reason you'd rather I didn't." Dell's grin flickered, just for a second. But Clara saw it, and Ethan saw it too. And Ethan went very still, the way he'd gone still in the store when he'd read the truth off a man's face. "It's a copy," Dell said. "The original's with the marshal." "Then a copy'll do. Hand it here." "I don't take orders on your porch or off at Walker. You rode up my mountain to hand me a paper," Ethan said. "So hand it to me. Or admit there's nothing in your fist but bluff and ride back down, and we'll all wait for a marshal, who I'm guessing isn't coming, because I'm guessing there's no more a marshal in this than there's a warrant in your hand." The two men stared at each other across the dying light. And then Dell Prentice did the thing that told Clara everything. He didn't hand over the paper. He crumpled it. His fist closed on it slow, and he shoved it into his coat, and his grin came back. But it was an uglier grin now. A grin with the bottom fallen out of it. "You want to do this the hard way," he said. "Fine. We'll do it the hard way. Boys, get down. We'll take the woman ourselves and let the marshal sort the paperwork after." And 6 men swung down off their horses. Clara's breath stopped. 6 men and one of Ethan and old Ruth in the house, and herself and the men were spreading out now, moving to flank the garden hands on their guns. And Dell Prentice was stepping down heavy off his horse with his thumbs in his belt and murder in his wet grin. And this was it. This was the thing Ethan had told her to get in the house to avoid, and she hadn't gone, and now, first man to touch her, Ethan said, loses the hand he does it with. He hadn't raised his voice. He never raised his voice, but there was a gun in that voice now, even though there wasn't yet one in his hand, and the 6 men stopped where they stood. Because there is a thing that comes off certain men in certain moments, a stillness that reads clearer than any shout, and every one of them felt it come off Ethan Walker. Now Walker, Dell said, but he'd stopped too. 6-1. You want to think about them odds? I've thought about them. Ethan's hand still hung loose and ready. 6-1. And I'll tell you what them odds mean, Dell. They mean whichever way this goes, I only need to be sure of one thing before it starts. His gray eyes moved cold and flat and settled on Dell's face and stayed there. And that's that the first bullet I fire finds you. Not your boys, you. So before anybody reaches for anything, you ask yourself if $200 of Silas Grady's lie is worth being the one man on this mountain who don't ride back down it. Nobody moved. The garden had gone dead silent, but for the blowing of the horses. And then, into that silence from the direction of the house, came the unmistakable double click of a shotgun's hammers being drawn back. "He miscounted boys," old Ruth said. She stood on the porch. 70 years old, brown and wrinkled as a walnut, and she had Ethan's father's old shotgun leveled over the porch rail with the steadiness of a woman who'd used one before, and her sharp eyes ran down the line of men without a flicker of fear. "It ain't 6-1, Ruth said. It's 6-2. And this here's a scattergun, so it don't much matter that my eyes ain't what they were. I pointed at that clump of you and pull, I'm bound to hit somebody, and at this range somebody's gonna lose a good deal more than a hand." She spat off the side of the porch. "Now, which of you fine town gentlemen wants to be the somebody?" The odds had changed, and every man there did the math, and the math had gotten worse. Dell Prentice's face had gone from red to purple. He'd come up the mountain sure of himself, sure of the lie, sure that a fugitive's shame would break Ethan Walker's back. And instead he was standing in a dead man's garden, with a cowboy promising him the first bullet, and a 70-year-old woman promising him the rest. And his men were looking at each other now instead of at Clara, and he could feel the whole thing slipping. "This isn't over," Dell said. "You hear me, Walker? The law's coming. Whether I brought the paper today or not, she's wanted, and that's true, and when the marshal comes—" "Then let him come," Ethan said. "Let the law come up this mountain in the daylight with a real warrant in a real hand, and I'll answer it like an honest man answers the law. But you're not the law, Dell. You're 6 drunk men Silas Grady sent up a mountain at dusk to steal a woman before anybody could ask a question in the light." Ethan took 1 step forward, and Dell took 1 step back, and the whole line of men felt their leader give ground. "Get on your horses. Get off my land. And you tell Silas Grady that if he wants Clara Bennett, he can bring his lie to the circuit judge in September and swear it out loud in the sunlight under oath, the same as I'll be swearing out what he did to this valley. And we'll let the judge decide which of us the liar is." The name landed like a stone. The circuit judge. September. The reckoning. Silas had been trying to escape, and Clara watched the fight go out of Dell Prentice because Dell was a bully, and bullies are only ever brave against people who can't fight back. And Ethan Walker could fight back, and old Ruth could fight back, and the circuit judge most certainly could fight back, and there was nothing left up this mountain for Dell to win. "Mount up," he told his men sour. "We're done here." They mounted, they wheeled their horses, and as they turned to go, Dell Prentice looked back one last time, not at Ethan but at Clara, and his wet grin came back small and vicious. "You run once already, girl," he called. "You'll run again. Your kind always does. And when you do, when you slip off this mountain in the night like you slipped out of Cheyenne, everybody's gonna know exactly what you are." He touched his hat, mocking. "See you around." And they rode down the mountain into the dark, and left the 3 of them standing in the ruined light of the garden, and the sound of the hooves faded and was gone. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Ruth lowered the shotgun and let out a long breath and said, "Well, my supper's good and cold now," and turned and went inside, and it was such an ordinary thing to say after such a thing that Clara might have laughed if she'd had any laughter left in her. But she didn't. She stood in the garden she'd brought back to life, and she felt the whole 3 weeks of it, the school, and the book, and the whorehound, and the plate at the table, and the almost said thing between them. She felt all of it turning to ash, because Dell Prentice was right about one thing. She had run once, and she knew standing there exactly what she had to do now. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I have to go." Ethan turned. "What?" "I have to leave. Tonight. Before the marshal, before whoever they bring up here comes." Her voice was steady, which surprised her, because inside she was coming apart. "You heard him. I'm wanted in Cheyenne. That part's true. Not the theft. I never took a penny, I swear to you on my father's grave. I never took a penny, but the warrant's real. There's a warrant with my name on it in Cheyenne, and if the law comes for me here, you'll have harbored a fugitive. And everything you've built these 3 weeks, everything you did to Silas in that street, it all comes apart. You become the fool who hit a thief, and Silas becomes the wronged man. And the whole valley he cheated gets cheated all over again, because nobody'll believe a word against him, once his accuser turns out to have protected a criminal." She was crying now, and she didn't bother to hide it. "I won't be the thing that undoes you, Ethan. I won't. You saved this valley. I won't be the reason it goes back to him. So I'll go. Tonight. And I'll go far, and I'll never say your name, and none of this will touch you." "No," Ethan said. "Ethan, no." He crossed the garden to her in 3 long strides, and he took her by the shoulders, and it was the first time he'd touched her in 3 weeks, and his hands were rough and warm and shaking. "You listen to me, Clara Bennett. You are not running. Not tonight, not ever, not off this mountain. You want to know why? Because running is what a guilty person does, and you didn't do the thing they said, and I am done. I am done. Watching innocent people get run off their own lives by liars, while good men stand quiet and let it happen." His voice broke. I stood quiet while my father walked into a storm. I stood quiet while Silas Grady took my sister's land. I have spent 6 years choking on all the times I stood quiet. And I will fall down dead in this garden before I stand quiet while you run off into the dark to save me from a lie. Do you hear me? I'm not worth it. Your name is worth more than my reputation. So we're not running. We're going to stand. And we're going to clear it. In the sunlight. The way I should have cleared everything my whole life. Clara stared up at him, her face wet, her heart hammering. You don't understand, she whispered. You don't know what happened in Cheyenne. You don't know that I can't clear it. I tried. I tried for 2 weeks. I begged them to look at the ledgers. I told them anybody could have taken that money, and it didn't matter, because the man who really took it was the schoolmaster's own son, and no one was ever going to believe a hired woman over the schoolmaster's son. That's why I ran Ethan. Not because I was guilty, because I was innocent, and it didn't matter because that's not how the world works for women like me. I learned that. I learned it the hard way, and I am not going to watch you learn it too. Ethan Walker went very still. The schoolmaster's son, he said slowly. Yes. Took the money and let you take the blame. Yes. And nobody would believe you over him. Nobody would even look, Ethan. That's the thing you don't understand about the world down there. Nobody would even look. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that stopped Clara's heart. I'll get someone to look. Ethan, there's a man, Ethan said, a friend of my father's, from back before, from when my folks were alive. His name is Judge Amos Caro, and he rides the territorial circuit, and he is the very judge coming through this valley in September to hear the case against Silas Grady. Ethan's grip tightened on her shoulders. And Amos Caro is the most stubborn, most honest, most bull-headed man I have ever known, and the one thing on this earth he cannot abide, the one thing that will make that old man take a case apart board by board until he finds the nail that don't fit, is a rich man's son who let a poor woman hang for his crime. His gray eyes burned. You said nobody in Cheyenne would look. Well, Cheyenne's not the whole world, Clara. There's a judge coming up this valley in 6 weeks who looks at exactly this kind of thing for the pure joy of it. And when he comes to hang Silas Grady's crimes on Silas Grady, I am going to put your case in front of him too. And he is going to send to Cheyenne for those ledgers. And he is going to look, Clara, the way nobody down there ever would. He was almost pleading now. So don't run. I'm begging you. Don't run into the dark and prove Del Prentice right. Stand with me till September, 6 weeks, and we'll clear your name and Silas's crimes in the same courtroom on the same day, and we'll do it in the sunlight, where they can't bury it under a counter. Clara couldn't speak. For a year, more than a year, she had carried the certainty bone deep and unshakable that the truth of her innocence would never matter to anyone, that she would spend her whole life running one town ahead of a lie she couldn't outrun. She had made her peace with it the way you make peace with a limp. And now a mountain cowboy was standing in a garden in the dark, telling her there was a judge who would look, that someone somewhere would finally look. Why? She managed. Why would you do all this? For me? You've known me 3 weeks. And Ethan Walker, who did not fill silence, who spoke rarely, and meant everything he said, looked down at Clara Bennett, with his whole broken heart open in his face. Because 3 weeks ago you walked into a store with 2 pennies and your father's necklace, he said, and you would rather have starved than let those people take your dignity. And I have never in my life seen anybody braver than that. And somewhere in the last 3 weeks, I don't know when, I couldn't tell you the day I stopped defending a stranger and started. His voice failed him. He tried again. I've had 5 empty chairs at my table for 6 years, Clara, and you sat down in one of them, and I don't want you to get up. He swallowed hard. That's why. That's the whole of why. I know it's too soon to say it. I know you didn't come up this mountain looking for a broken-down cowboy twice your I know. But you asked me why, and I've spent 6 years lying to myself, and I'm done lying, so there it is. That's why. Clara looked up at him, And for the second time in 3 weeks, in the space between two heartbeats, everything in her life changed. She had come up this mountain because she had nowhere else to go. She had stayed because there was a garden to save, and a school to teach, and a book to learn. She had told herself it was gratitude and duty, and the simple animal comfort of a roof and a plate. She had told herself a great many things, but standing there in the dark with her name a ruin, and the law coming, and a lie riding down the mountain to hunt her, she looked up into Ethan Walker's weathered, wounded, wide-open face, and she stopped telling herself things. "It's not too soon," she said. Ethan went still. "It's not too soon, Ethan." She lifted one hand and laid it flat against his chest over his hammering heart. "I've been telling myself it was gratitude. For 3 weeks. I've been telling myself I stayed for the garden. But I didn't come out to that garden every morning before dawn for the garden. And I didn't learn your mother's book so I could sit up by lamplight and have you lean over my shoulder and tell me about grinding cherry bark as a boy for the sake of the cough syrup." Her voice was shaking now, but not with fear. "I stayed because a man stepped out of a doorway and said, 'I know enough.' And I have wanted every day since to be somebody who knew enough about you too. So no, it's not too soon. It's exactly soon enough." For a moment, neither of them moved, and then Ethan Walker did something Clara had not seen him do in 3 weeks. He laughed, a real laugh, low and cracked and full of 6 years of held breath, finally let go, and he pulled her against him, and he held her there in the dark garden, with his chin on the top of her head, and his arms around her, like a man who'd found something he'd stopped believing was findable. And Clara pressed her face into his shirt and held on. And for a long moment, there were no liars and no warrants, and no marshal coming. There was just the two of them, and the garden they'd brought back, and the mountain gone dark and quiet all around. Then Ruth's voice came from the porch dry as dust. "If you two are done," she called, "I'd like to point out that 6 armed men just rode down this mountain madder than hornets, and I'd feel a good deal better if we all got behind a barred door before we did any more courting." They broke apart, both of them half laughing, and went in, and Ruth barred the door behind them, and the 3 of them sat up late by the fire, with the shotgun leaned against the wall, and they made a plan. The plan was, Ethan's mostly though, Clara sharpened it, and Ruth salted it with the hard practical wisdom of 70 years. They would not run. That was the first thing, the thing everything else hung on. Running would prove the lie. So they would stay, and they would stand, and they would fight it in the daylight. But standing meant getting to September, and getting to September meant surviving whatever Silas Grady sent up the mountain in the meantime, and Silas would send more. They all knew it. He was ruined and cornered and out of every option. But the desperate ones and desperate men do desperate things. So Ethan would ride the next day down and out of the valley, not to town, but past it west to the little settlement of Miller's Crossing, where the territorial telegraph ran, and he would send a wire to Judge Amos Caro. He'd lay it all out. Silas Grady's crimes, the buried letter, the stolen land, his own sister's land, and Clara's case, the theft in Cheyenne, the schoolmaster's son, the ledgers that would clear her if anybody would only send for them and look. He would ask the judge to come early if he could, and to come ready, and above all to send to Cheyenne for those ledgers before he ever set foot in the valley, so the truth would be waiting when he arrived. And while Ethan rode, Clara would stay on the mountain with Ruth and the shotgun and the barred door, and she would keep teaching and keep tending the garden and keep living her life in the full light of day, because the best answer to a lie that says you'll run in the night is to be seen every single day, not running. "They'll come again," Ethan said low, staring into the fire. "While I'm gone, most likely. Silas'll know I've ridden out. He'll send them when he thinks you're alone. Then he'll find I'm not alone," Ruth said, and patted the shotgun. "Ruth, Ethan Walker." The old woman fixed him with her sharp eyes. "I chaperoned your mother when she was courting your father, and I helped birth you into this very house, and I have shot a man before and found I've got the stomach for it if the man needs shooting. You ride your wire. I'll keep your girl. And if Del Prentice comes up this mountain again looking for a woman alone, he'll get the surprise of his miserable life. She sniffed. Now go to bed, the both of you. Separate rooms. I'm still the chaperone, courting or no courting, and I'll not have the valley say I let standards slip. And so it was settled. Ethan rode out before dawn. Clara stood on the porch and watched him go. Watched him and the big bay horse pick their way down the dark track, and just before the trees took him, he turned in the saddle and lifted his hat to her. Not the mocking tip Del Prentice had given, but a real one. Slow and deliberate, a promise in the shape of a gesture. And Clara lifted her hand. And then he was gone into the trees, and she was alone on the mountain with an old woman and a shotgun, and a lie coming for her. And she went inside and taught the valley's children their letters, as if it were any other day, because that was the plan. And the plan was to be seen not running. They came on the third day, just as Ethan had said they would. Not 6 of them this time. 3. Del Prentice and 2 others riding up in the flat, white light of noon bold, now in daylight, because they'd learned their lesson about dusk and figured a woman alone in the daytime was a different matter than a cowboy at nightfall. Clara saw them from the schoolhouse. Ethan had built a lean-to schoolroom off the barn so she wouldn't have to go down to town, and she was teaching in it when she saw the riders come up the track, and her heart went to her throat, but she did not run. She sent the children home the back way, quick and quiet, all 9 of them, scattering down the mountain paths they knew like their own hands. And then she walked out to meet the riders in the yard, in the daylight, in full view, exactly as the plan said. Ruth came out onto the porch behind her with the shotgun. "Far enough," Ruth called when the 3 were still a good distance off. Del reined in. He was grinning again. "Now we don't want trouble, Grandma. We just come to talk to Miss Bennett, friendly-like." "You can talk from there," Clara said. Del's grin tightened. He didn't like her steadiness. He'd wanted her afraid, a woman alone, her protector gone, the lie closing in. And instead she stood in the yard with her chin level and looked at him like he was a stain. "Walker's gone," Del said. "Rode out 3 days back, west. We know because we've been watching the roads." He walked his horse a step closer, and Ruth's shotgun came up and he stopped. "You want to know where I think he went, girl? I think he ran. I think your cowboy heard the truth about you and decided a thief wasn't worth hanging his neck out for, and he lit out and left you up here with the old woman to face the marshal alone." He spread his hands. "So here's my offer, and it's a better one than last time. Come down with us. Quiet. Give yourself up to the marshal in town and confess clean, and it'll go easier on you. Because Walker's not coming back, Clara. No man comes back for a thief. You're up here waiting on a rescue that already rode off and forgot your name." And for one cold second the poison in it worked, because it was the exact shape of Clara's oldest fear. Not the warrant, not the marshal. The fear that ran deeper than either, that she was in the end a thing people left. That her mother had died and left her, and her father had died and left her, and the town in Cheyenne had turned on her and left her, and that everyone eventually learned what she was and left. Del Prentice had reached past the warrant and put his dirty thumb right on that oldest bruise, and for 1 second Clara felt it press. And then she heard in her own memory, clear as a bell, "I've had 5 empty chairs at my table for 6 years, and you sat down in one of them, and I don't want you to get up." And Clara Bennett lifted her chin and she smiled at Del Prentice, and the smile was the most dangerous thing in the whole yard. "You want to know where Ethan Walker went," she said. "I'll tell you, since you rode all this way to guess wrong. He went to send a wire. To a judge. Judge Amos Caro, who rides this circuit, who's coming to this valley in September, and who was a friend of Ethan's father before you were old enough to be a bully Del Prentice. And do you know what that wire says?" She took a step toward him, and now it was Del whose horse shifted back. "It says Silas Grady buried a school teacher's letter to steal the land the school sits on. It says Silas Grady's been calling in false debts to buy up creek land ahead of the railroad. It names every family in this valley he's cheated, Hendricks and the widow Calloway, and Ethan's own sister Sarah, whose land Silas took 6 years ago the same dirty way." Her voice rang across the yard now, and the 2 men behind Del were looking at each other uneasy. "And it says one more thing. It says there's a woman up on that mountain who was blamed for a theft she didn't commit by a schoolmaster who'd sooner hang a hired girl than admit his own son's a thief, and it asks the judge to send to Cheyenne for the ledgers and look. Just look. Because that's all it takes, Dell. Just one honest man willing to look. She stopped a few feet from his horse, close enough to see the doubt crawling across his red face. So, you go on back down to Silas Grady, and you tell him his lies already left this mountain. It's riding west on a telegraph wire to the one man in this territory who can't be bought and can't be bullied and lives to take rich men's lies apart. And you tell him September's coming. And you tell him, her voice dropped cold and clear, that he'd have done better to feed a hungry woman than to laugh at her, because that hungry woman is going to watch him answer for every cruel thing he's ever done in the sunlight under oaths, before God and a judge and this whole valley. Now get off this mountain. The yard was silent. Dell Prentice stared at her, and his mouth opened, and no words came out because she had taken his whole game and turned it inside out and handed it back to him, empty. He'd come up expecting a frightened woman waiting on a rescue that wasn't coming. He'd found a woman who knew the rescue was already halfway to the judge and who wasn't frightened at all. You're bluffing, he managed. There's no wire. He didn't. Ride to Miller's Crossing and ask the telegraph man, Clara said. It's a 2-day ride. I'll wait right here, in the daylight, not running. You go ask him if a big mountain cowboy sent a wire to Judge Caro 3 days back, and then you come back and call me a bluffer to my face. She folded her arms. Or you can save yourself the trip and believe me. Either way, Dell, you've lost. You just haven't ridden far enough down the mountain to feel it yet. And that was the moment Dell Prentice broke. Not into violence. Into something worse for him, into the sick realization dawning slow across his heavy face that he'd bet on the wrong side, that Silas Grady was a ruined man, dragging everyone who'd helped him down into the ruin that come September. There'd be a judge asking who rode up a mountain to steal a woman and threaten an old lady, and that his own name would be on that list. This ain't over, he said, but it was the third time he'd said it, and it had less in it every time. It's over, Clara said. You just don't like how it ended. Dell wheeled his horse. He didn't say anything else. He and his 2 men rode down the mountain in the flat noon light, and this time nobody called a parting threat over their shoulder, because there was nothing left to threaten with, and Clara stood in the yard and watched them go until they were small and then gone. Then her legs went out from under her. Ruth caught her 70 years old and quick as a girl when it counted and eased her down onto the porch step, and Clara sat there shaking all the steadiness pouring out of her at once. Now that there was no one left to be steady for, and she pressed her hands to her face and shook. There now, Ruth said, sitting beside her, one arm around her shoulders. There now. You did fine. You did better than fine. I've watched grown men fold up smaller than that with a shotgun on 'em, and you faced down 3 with nothing but your own 2 feet and a mouthful of the truth. The old woman squeezed her. Ethan Walker's a lucky man, and I'll tell him so. He's not back yet, Clara said into her hands. He's 2 more days out at least. And Dell's right about one thing. Silas is cornered now worse than ever. He knows the wire's gone. He knows September's coming for him. A cornered man that's got nothing left to lose. She lifted her face. Ruth, he's not going to wait for September. He can't. If that judge sends for the Cheyenne ledgers and looks, Silas is finished not just for cheating the valley, but for swearing out a false warrant for everything. His only chance now is to make sure that wire never turns into a courtroom. And there's only 2 ways to do that. Ruth's face had gone grave. Say them. Stop the judge from coming, Clara said slowly. Or stop us from being here to testify when he does. And as she said it, as the words left her mouth in the bright noon yard, a single rider appeared at the bottom of the track. Not Ethan. Not on Ethan's bay. A smaller horse ridden hard lathered white, and a small figure low over its neck coming up the mountain fast as the animal could climb. Ruth was up with the shotgun before Clara had finished rising. But as the rider came closer, Clara saw it was no man at all. It was a girl, a child, 10 or 11. Dark-haired, riding bareback, and breathless, and Clara had never seen her before, but knew her at once, knew her by the shape of her face, by the set of her jaw, by something around the gray eyes. The girl hauled her blown horse to a stop in the yard, and half fell off it, and stood swaying, and gasped out the words she'd ridden a mountain to say. "Are you Clara? The teacher? Are you her?" "I'm her," Clara said, catching the girl by the arms. "I'm Clara. Who are you? What's wrong?" The girl looked up at her with Ethan Walker's own gray eyes streaming tears. "I'm Ellie," she gasped. "Ellie Walker. Sarah's my ma. Uncle Ethan's he came to see us. He finally came." She could barely get the words out. "You have to come. Ma sent me. She said ride fast, ride to the mountain and find the teacher." The girl's whole body shook. "They took him. Silas Grady's men. They were waiting on the West Road. They knew Uncle Ethan rode out. They were waiting for him to come back." A sob tore out of her. "They took Uncle Ethan. And Ma heard Mr. Grady say she heard him say he's not going to any courtroom in September. She heard him say the wire don't matter if there's nobody left alive to stand up in front of the judge and read it." For a moment Clara couldn't breathe. The girl's words hung in the noon air. They took Uncle Ethan, and the whole yard seemed to tilt under her feet, and everything in her wanted to sink down onto the porch step and come apart. But she didn't, because a girl of 10 had ridden a mountain bareback on a blown horse to bring her this and that girl, was standing in front of her shaking. And Clara Bennett had learned a long time ago that you do not get to fall apart when a child is watching you for what to do next. "Ellie!" She dropped to her knees in the dirt so she was level with the girl's face, and took both the child's hands in hers, and made her voice as steady as she'd made it in the store 3 weeks ago with a whole town laughing. "Ellie, look at me. You did exactly right. You rode fast, and you found me, and you told me everything, and that was the bravest thing anybody could have done. Now I need you to do one more brave thing. I need you to breathe, slow, with me." She breathed in and out, and the girl copied her hitching, gulping. "There. Good. Now, tell me the rest. Where did they take him?" "I don't know." Ellie's chin trembled. "Ma didn't see. She only heard. She was hanging wash behind the boarding house, and Mr. Grady's men rode in, and she heard them through the wall. They were at the back of the store. They didn't know she was there, and they said they'd got him. They said he fought, but there was 5 of them, and one had a broke arm to show for it." A watery, fierce pride flickered through her tears. "Uncle Ethan broke somebody's arm." "Course he did," Ruth said grimly from the porch. "And then Mr. Grady came." Ellie's voice dropped, and the fear came back into it deeper than before. "And Ma said his voice was, she said she never heard him talk like that. Quiet. Not the store voice. And he said—" The girl screwed her eyes shut, dragging the words up exactly as she'd carried them up the mountain. "He said the wire's already gone, so the woman doesn't matter anymore. But the wire doesn't matter either if there's nobody left to stand up in court and read it. Dead men don't testify. And a woman with no protector runs. So we finish it clean. We finish it tonight. Both of them. And come September, there's no case because there's no witnesses, and I've been the richest man in a valley full of accidents before." Ellie opened her eyes, and they were huge and streaming. "That's what he said, Miss Clara. Ma made me say it back to her 3 times so I'd get it right. Both of them. Tonight. And then she put me on the horse and said, 'Find the teacher, warn her, before it's too late.'" The yard went dead silent. Both of them. Tonight. Clara stood up slowly, and something happened inside her as she stood. Something she would try to explain to Ethan later and never quite manage. The fear didn't leave. It was still there, cold in her belly, the oldest fear and the newest one both. But over the top of it, like ice forming on a fast river, something hard and clear and absolutely calm settled into place. For a year she had run. She had run from Cheyenne, run from the lie, run from every town that learned her name. She had made herself small and quiet and quick to leave, because that was how you survived when the world had decided what you were. And it had gotten her nothing. It had gotten her a torn travel bag and 2 pennies and a whole town laughing. She was done running. "Ruth," Clara said. Her voice had gone very quiet and very level. "How far to town?" 2 hours walking, less on the mule." "And how many men does Silas Grady have?" Ruth's eyes narrowed. "Now hold on, you're not thinking of—" "How many, Ruth?" The old woman studied her a long moment, then grimly, 6 or 7 he can count on, more if he pays. But those 5 that took Ethan Grady won't keep him in town. Too many eyes even now, even in that town. Somebody'd talk. No. Ruth's weathered face worked as she thought. If Grady means to make it look like an accident, he'll take Ethan somewhere lonely. Somewhere a man could plausibly fall or drown or— She stopped because Ellie was right there. Somewhere out of the way. "The creek," Clara said. Both of them looked at her. "Silas told the whole street where the railroad's going," Clara said, and her mind was moving fast now, faster than the fear laying it out piece by piece. "Where the creek meets the road. He's been buying up creek land for a year. He knows that creek better than any man alive because that creek is the whole reason for everything he's done. And a creek is where a man drowns Ruth. A creek is where a body washes up, and the coroner writes misadventure, and the richest man in a valley of accidents buries another one." She was certain now, bone certain. "He'll take Ethan to the creek, and he'll wait for dark. He said tonight. He needs the dark to do it clean." "That's a guess," Ruth said. "It's the best guess we've got, and we don't have time for a better one." Clara turned to the girl. "Ellie, your horse is blown, she can't carry you back. But you know these mountains. You've lived in this valley your whole life. Is there anyone at all between here and town who'd help us? Not the men who cheered Ethan in the street 3 weeks ago and then let Silas frighten them quiet. Someone with backbone. Someone Silas hasn't been able to buy or scare." Ellie thought hard, wiping her nose. "Mr. Hendricks," she said. "The old rancher. Silas took his Southfield. He's got 3 grown sons, and they're all mad about it. My ma says madder every day. And the widow Calloway." The girl hesitated. "She was awful to you, Miss Clara. But my ma says since that day in the street she's been different. Cried in church, my ma said. Told the Reverend she'd done a wicked thing turning a girl into the road." "And the Reverend," Clara said softly. "Reverend Pryor." "He's old," Ruth warned. "He can't fight. He doesn't need to fight." Clara's eyes had gone bright and hard. "He needs to do exactly what he did 3 weeks ago. He needs to stand in the sunlight and make people ashamed of the dark. That's a weapon too, Ruth. It's the weapon that started all this." She was already moving, thinking, planning. "Here's what we do. Ruth, you take the mule and ride for Hendricks. You're known. They'll open the door to you where they might not to me. Tell them everything. Tell them Silas Grady's got Ethan Walker and means to drown him in that creek tonight and call it an accident. Tell them if a man can be disappeared for crossing Silas, then not one of their fields, not one of their sons is safe either. And tell them—" Her voice caught, then steadied. "Tell them the man who stood up for this whole valley in that street, the man who's bringing the judge that might get their land back, is about to die for it unless honest men stop being afraid tonight." "And you?" Ruth demanded. "What'll you be doing while I raise the valley?" Clara looked down the mountain toward the creek, toward the dark that was hours off yet, but coming. "I'm going to find where they're holding him," she said, "before dark. Because if I'm wrong about the creek, if he's somewhere else, then all your riders and all the Reverend's shame won't matter, because they'll be searching the wrong ground while Silas finishes it. Somebody has to know for certain where Ethan is, so I'm going to go and find out. Alone." Ruth's voice cracked like a whip. "You're going to walk down that mountain into the teeth of the man that just said, both of them tonight. Alone, and find where they've got Ethan. Have you lost your senses, girl? That's not brave. That's throwing your life after his. He didn't leave me." Clara's voice broke clean in half, and she let it. 3 weeks ago I was a stranger with nothing, and every soul in that valley looked at me and saw a problem to be rid of, and one man stepped out of a doorway and would not let me be thrown away. And when I told him to run, when I begged him to save himself and let me go, he took me by the shoulders, and he said he'd fall down dead in his own garden before he'd stand quiet and watch me get run off my own life. The tears came now hot and fast, but her voice underneath them was iron. "So don't you tell me it's throwing my life away, Ruth, because that man out there does not know how to leave people. It's the thing that's been killing him for 6 years that he thinks he left everyone when the truth is, he'd sooner die than leave a single one of us. And I will not be the one person Ethan Walker gave everything to, who turned around and left him to drown in the dark to save my own skin. I'd rather die beside him than live one day as the woman who ran." Ruth stared at her. And whatever the old woman saw in Clara's streaming iron face, it made her close her mouth on whatever argument she'd been building, and it made her slowly nod. "All right," Ruth said quietly. "All right, girl. God help the both of you, but all right." She was already moving toward the barn and the mule. "But you don't go and get yourself caught being a hero. You find where they've got him, and you keep your fool self hid, and you wait for the valley to come. You hear me? You are the eyes, not the army. You find him, and you hide and you wait." "I hear you," Clara said. "Say it back." "I'm the eyes, not the army. I find him and I hide and I wait. See that you remember it." Ruth hauled herself onto the mule with a grunt and looked down at Ellie. "Child, you're spent, and your horse is spent, and you'll be no more use ridden into the ground. You come with me far as the fork, then you cut off home to your ma, and you tell her Ruth's raising the Hendricks boys, and the teacher's gone for the creek, and to pray like she's never prayed. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am," Ellie said. Then to Clara, fierce through her tears. "You saved my uncle. He came back. He finally came back to us after all these years, and Ma cried and cried the good kind you save him, Miss Clara." Clara knelt one more time and kissed the girl's forehead. "I'll bring him home to your ma," she said. "I promise you, I'll bring him home." And then Ruth and the mule and the girl on her blown horse went down the track toward Hendricks and the fork and the raising of the valley, and Clara Bennett went into the house and took Ethan's father's old shotgun down from the wall. Ruth had left. It had a pistol of her own besides, and she loaded it the way Ethan had shown her one quiet evening on the porch, not thinking she'd ever need to, and she took the box of shells, and she started down the mountain on foot, toward the creek, and toward the dark, and toward the man who did not know how to leave people. "Yes, I'd." She smelled the smoke before she saw anything. She'd come down off the mountain the back way, along the deer paths Ellie had described at the fork before they'd parted, keeping off the road, moving from cover to cover, the way you move when your whole life depends on not being seen. The afternoon had bled away into the long gold of evening, and then into the blue hush before dark, and her arms ached from the weight of the shotgun, and her feet were raw in her boots, and she'd begun in the worst part of herself to fear she'd guessed wrong, that Ethan was somewhere else entirely. Some barn or cellar or lonely draw. And she'd walked 4 hours to the wrong empty creek while a good man drowned across the valley. And then she smelled wood smoke on the evening air, and she went still and she crept toward it. There was an old line shack down where the creek bent a half-fallen cabin from some failed homestead, the kind of place Silas Grady would know, because Silas Grady knew every inch of creek land in the valley, and there was smoke coming from its crooked chimney, and there were horses tied outside it. More than a lonely shack had any business holding, and there was a man with a rifle sitting on a stump by the door. Clara sank down behind a deadfall and pressed her hand over her own mouth to keep her breathing quiet, and she counted the horses. 6. And she knew with a cold, sick certainty that she had guessed right after all. She lay behind the deadfall as the last light went out of the sky, and she watched, and she made herself think instead of feel, because feeling would get Ethan killed. 6 horses, 1 guard she could see. That likely meant 5 men inside, plus the one on the stump. And Silas, she didn't see a 7th horse fine enough for Silas Grady, which meant either Silas wasn't here yet, or Silas wasn't coming until it was time, until full dark, until the deed itself. We finish it tonight. He'd come, she was sure of it. A man like Silas Grady wouldn't trust a thing this important to hirelings alone. He'd want to see it done, want to stand on the bank and watch the creek take his last problem. He'd come at full dark, which meant she had a little time. Not much, but a little. And she was the eyes, not the army. She was to find him and hide and wait for the valley. But the valley was 2 hours behind her at best, if Ruth had even reached the Hendricks boys. If the Hendricks boys had even agreed to come, if a dozen frightened ranchers could be shamed and frightened and rallied into riding through the dark to stand against Silas Grady's guns, and every one of those ifs was a thing that might not happen. And even if all of them happened, they were 2 hours away. And full dark was not 2 hours away. Full dark was minutes away. And when full dark came, Silas Grady would ride down to this creek and drown the only man who'd ever refused to let Clara Bennett be thrown away. I'm the eyes, not the army. I find him, and I hide, and I wait. She'd promised Ruth. And lying there behind the deadfall in the failing light with the shotgun cold in her hands and her heart breaking, Clara Bennett understood that she was going to break that promise. Because waiting was a thing you did when waiting could save someone. And waiting tonight would only mean the valley arrived in 2 hours to find a body in a creek and a rich man's alibi already forming. Waiting was just running with the feet held still. And she was done running in every way there was to run. So she was going to have to be the army after all. One woman, a shotgun, 6 men and a coming murder. She almost laughed lying there. It was madness. Ethan would be furious. Ruth would skin her. And she was going to do it anyway. Because the alternative was to lie in the dark and let him die within her sight to keep a promise, and she would sooner die herself. But not stupidly. Not by walking up to a man with a rifle on a stump and getting shot for nothing. If she was going to spend her one life buying Ethan minutes, she had to buy him as many as she could, and she had to buy them clever, she thought. And then she thought of the one thing Silas Grady wanted more than he wanted Ethan Walker dead. He wanted the wire stopped. He wanted the case gone. He wanted no witnesses standing up in September to read out his crimes. Ethan dead was half of that. But the other half, the half Silas thought was already handled, the half that had ridden off on a telegraph wire he couldn't recall, the other half was her, Clara Bennett. The woman whose case would put the judge onto the Cheyenne ledgers, the woman whose false warrant Silas had sworn out, and would answer for the woman who was, if she stood in that September courtroom, every bit as dangerous to Silas Grady as Ethan was. Both of them. Tonight. He didn't just want Ethan dead. He wanted them both dead. And he thought she was up a mountain waiting to be fetched, or waiting to run. He didn't know she was 50 feet from his line shack with a loaded gun. And a man who wants 2 people dead, and has one of them, and hears that the second one has walked right into his hands of her own foolish free will, that man does not order her shot from the doorway. That man wants to talk, wants to gloat, wants to understand how his luck ran so good. A man like Silas Grady, cornered and desperate, and finally holding all the cards, would not be able to help himself. She could buy time with that. She could buy Ethan minutes, the minutes the valley needed to close the distance, by walking into that shack and giving Silas Grady the one thing he'd want to do before he killed her. She could make him talk. It was insane. It was very likely the last thing she'd ever do. But she thought of Ethan taking her by the shoulders in the dark garden. I'll fall down dead before I stand quiet. And she understood him now in a way she never quite had before, understood the terrible freeing arithmetic of it, that there are things worth more than your own skin, and that once you know what they are, the fear doesn't leave, but it stops being the thing that decides. Clara checked the shotgun one last time. Both barrels loaded. She had Ruth's know. Ruth had taken her pistol. She had the shotgun and the box of shells and nothing else, and a plan that was mostly hope. She waited until the guard on the stump turned his head to spit, and then she stepped out from behind the deadfall into the last blue light and walked toward the line shack with the shotgun held low and ready at her hip, and called out in a clear, steady voice that carried across the whole clearing, "I'm looking for Silas Grady. Tell him Clara Bennett's come to save him a trip up the mountain." The guard came off the stump like he'd sat on a snake rifle swinging up. "Don't," Clara said. Just that. And something in how she said it, the flat certainty of it, the twin black eyes of the shotgun leveled at his belly, made him freeze with his own rifle half raised. "I've got both barrels on you, and I'm close enough I won't miss. And if you shoot me, your friends inside will still have to explain a dead schoolteacher and the gunshot that brought the whole valley running. So let's neither of us be stupid. Go inside. Tell them who's here. Tell them I've come alone, and I've come to talk, and I'll set my gun down at the door if they'll set theirs down inside." She lifted her chin. "Tell Silas Grady his last two problems can be solved tonight without a single shot fired if he's got the nerve to hear how. Go on, tell him." The guard stared at her. Then he backed toward the door, keeping his rifle on her, and kicked it with his heel, and called through it low and urgent, and Clara heard the scrape of chairs inside, and low voices. And then the door opened wide, and yellow lamplight spilled out into the blue dark, and men filled the doorway with guns in their hands, and behind them, at a rough table tied to a chair, with his lips split, and one eye swelling shut, and dried blood dark on his temple, Ethan, alive. Their eyes met across the lamplit shack, and Clara watched 100 things cross his battered face in half a second shock and terror, and a fury so absolute it looked like grief. And she watched him strain against the ropes and open his split mouth to roar at her to run. "Run, run! Don't!" Clara said again to all of them before he could get the word out. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that after. However badly the rest of it went, her voice did not shake. "I came to talk. I set my gun down, you set yours down, and we talk. That's the deal. That's the only deal there is." And then a voice from the shadowed back of the shack, quiet, not the store voice, said, "Well now." Silas Grady stepped into the lamplight. He was here after all. He'd come early. And he looked at Clara Bennett standing in his doorway with a shotgun, and something moved across his soft face that was almost admiration and almost hunger. "The schoolteacher," Silas said softly, "walked right down the mountain into my lap, and here I was fixing to send men up to fetch you." He smiled, and it was the worst smile Clara had ever seen, worse than the store, worse than anything. "You know, girl, I keep underestimating you. I truly do. 3 weeks running, and you keep surprising me." He gestured easy, and the men lowered their guns a fraction, not all the way, but a fraction. "All right. Set your gun down at the door like you said, and come in. And let's you and me talk. I confess I'm curious what a dead woman thinks she's got to bargain with." And Clara Bennett, buying minutes with her life bent slow and set. Ethan Walker's father's shotgun down on the threshold, and straightened, and walked into the lion's den, with her chin held level, and her empty hands open at her sides. "Clara," Ethan said hoarsely from the chair wrecked breaking. "Clara, no, why did you were supposed to be safe, you were supposed to—" "I don't know how to leave people either," Clara said softly, not taking her eyes off Silas. "Turns out it's catching." "Sit her down," Silas said. A man shoved a chair against the backs of her knees, and Clara sat across the rough table from Ethan, close enough to see how bad they'd hurt him, and far enough that she couldn't reach him. She kept her hands flat and open on the table where everyone could see them. She kept her breathing slow. She was counting under everything, counting minutes, counting the distance to Hendricks and back, counting how long Ruth had had. Praying the valley was already riding through the dark toward this creek. Every minute she kept Silas Grady talking was a minute closer. "So," Silas said, settling into a chair with the ease of a man who's already won. "Talk. You said you could solve my last two problems without a shot fired. I'll be honest, I don't see how, seeing as my two problems are sitting right in front of me, and the simplest solution's a length of rope and a deep part of the creek. But you've earned a hearing. Go on. Surprise me one more time." "I will," Clara said. "But first I want to understand it, all of it, because I've been 3 weeks in this valley, trying to work out what kind of man buries a schoolteacher's letter and lets children go ignorant to line his own pocket, and I still can't make it fit." She tilted her head. "The railroad, the creek, Sarah Walker's land 6 years ago, and Hendricks's south field, and the widow's flower. Help me understand it, Silas. If I'm going to die tonight, let me at least die understanding the man who's doing it. That's not much to ask." And Silas Grady, vein-cornered, holding all the cards, unable to help himself exactly, as she'd gambled, leaned back and told her. He told her all of it. He told her about the railroad survey he'd bribed a man to see 2 years early, and the certainty of where the depot would go, and the fortune waiting in the creekland for any man ruthless enough to gather it before the valley understood what it had. He told her with something like pride how he'd spent 6 years calling in false debts and adjusting ledgers no rancher could read, and squeezing the small holders off their creekland, one desperate winter at a time. He told her about Sarah Walker's husband, the credit line. The ruin told it lightly, like an old business triumph. While 2 feet away, Ethan Walker strained against his ropes and shook. He told her he'd known the very hour the new schoolteacher stepped off the Tuesday stage and had run her out of his store, not from cruelty, not personal. Girl never think it was personal. But because the school sat on the depot ground and a teacher settling in was an obstacle to be cleared, and Ethan listening made a low broken sound and said, "You knew, all this time. You knew who she was and why she'd come, and you laughed at her in front of the whole town anyway. You'd have let her starve on the road for a piece of dirt." "It's always been about the dirt walker," Silas said. "Only ever the dirt. The girl was nothing. You made her something. If you'd stayed up your mountain like you had for 6 years, none of this happens. She gets run off the school, gets moved, and come spring, I'm the richest man in the territory and nobody the wiser." His face darkened. "But no. You had to pick that one morning, that one girl, to finally grow yourself a conscience. 6 years I had you handled. 6 years you sat up there choking on your own guilt, and never once came down. And then a girl with 2 pennies walks into my store, and suddenly, Ethan Walker remembers he's got a spine." He shook his head, and now the softness was gone, and something ugly and final was in his voice. "So, yes, both of you, tonight. Because I have come too far and buried too much to have it all torn down in September by a hermit and a schoolteacher. The wire's already gone, I can't stop that. But a wire's just paper. It needs a living mouth to read it into the record and swear to it. Dead men don't testify. And a drowned schoolteacher and a cowboy who fell off his horse in the dark well." He spread his hands. "The valley's seen sadder accidents. I've arranged a few." There it was. Clara had it now. All of it. The whole confession laid out plain in a lamplit shack in front of Ethan and 5 hired men, if any of them lived to repeat it. "That's a great deal of guilt for one man to carry," Clara said quietly. "I sleep fine." "I believe you do." She held his eyes. "But you've made one mistake, Silas. The same mistake you've made all along. The same mistake that started this whole thing 3 weeks ago in your store." Silas's smile flickered. "And what's that?" "You think a person's worth is measured by what they carry." Clara's voice was very steady, very clear, and pitched, though none of them knew it to carry through thin walls out into a dark clearing, where God-willing honest men were even now spreading through the trees. "You looked at me 3 weeks ago, and saw 2 pennies and a torn bag, and an old necklace you called worthless, and you decided I was nothing. You looked at Sarah Walker's husband, and saw a debt, and decided he was nothing. You look at this whole valley, and you see ledgers and dirt and obstacles, and you've never once in your whole life understood the thing that even the poorest person in Red Hollow understands." She leaned forward. "A person isn't worth what they carry, Silas. A person is worth what they're willing to give. And you have never in your life given a single thing you didn't expect back double. That's why you'll lose. That's why you've already lost. Because I walked down a mountain tonight ready to give my life for that man, and there is not one soul on this earth who'd walk across the road to give anything for you. Not your hired men, not your neighbors, not your own son who fetches your mail and hides your crimes and hates you for it. You've spent 60 years gathering Silas Grady, and you're going to die with your hands full and your name a curse, and nobody will grieve you." The shack had gone silent, and Silas Grady's soft face had gone white, then red, and Clara saw she'd struck something true and deep, some old wound under all the money, and for one moment she thought she'd overplayed it, thought he'd have her shot on the spot. And then, faint from outside, from the dark clearing, came a sound. The soft nicker of a horse that was not one of theirs. and a twig snapping under a boot that did not belong. Silas heard it too. His head came up. His eyes narrowed. What was— "Hendricks!" A voice roared out of the dark, huge and furious, an old rancher's voice, cracked with years and rage. "Silas Grady, this is Amos Hendricks, and I've got my 3 sons and 12 honest men of this valley in the trees around this shack, and every gun's on that door. You hear me, Grady? The whole valley's here. We heard every word. We've been standing in the dark, listening to you brag on, cheating us for a year, and by God, it ends tonight." Chaos erupted. The hired men lunged for the windows, the door their guns, and Silas Grady spun, snarling, and Clara Bennett did the only thing left to do, the thing she'd been waiting the whole confession to do, the thing every counted minute had been buying toward. She threw herself across the table at Ethan. Not to free him. There was no time, the ropes were tight, and her fingers too slow. She threw herself over him between his tied body and the men and their guns, wrapping her arms around his head and shoulders, and putting her own back to the room, making herself a shield of her own body over the man she'd walked down a mountain to save. Because if this went to shooting, the first person Silas would want dead was Ethan, and the only thing Clara had left to give was the thing she'd come here already prepared to give. "Clara." Ethan's voice broke against her. "Clara, get down. Get off me, get—" "No!" she said into his bloody hair, fierce final. "I'm not leaving you. Not ever. Do you hear me? I'm not—" "Throw down your guns!" Hendricks bellowed from the dark. And now there were other voices, with a dozen of them, ringing the shack and the terrible metallic music of a dozen hammers cocking in the trees. "You're surrounded, boys, and we outnumber you 2 to 1, and we are not the frightened valley you've been kicking for a year. Throw 'em down, or so help me, God. We'll drop every man that don't." And in the lamplit shack, the 5 hired men looked at each other. They were paid men. And paid men do arithmetic. 12 guns in the dark against 5 in a lit box, and no amount of Silas Grady's money spends in a grave, and one by one cursing, they let their weapons clatter to the floor and raise their hands. All but Silas. Silas Grady stood alone in the middle of his own trap, watching it close, watching 6 years of gathering come apart in a single lamplit minute, and something broke in him that had never broken before, and he lunged not for a gun, but for the thing that had ruined him, the thing he hated most in all the world. His soft hands going for Clara Bennett's throat, where she lay shielding Ethan across the table. He never reached her, because Ethan Walker, tied to a chair, beaten half to death, threw his whole roped body sideways with a roar and hit Silas Grady with his shoulder like a falling tree. And the 2 of them went down in a crash of chair and table and lamp, and the light went out and the door burst open, and the honest men of the valley poured into the dark shack with their guns and their lanterns, and it was over. It was over in less than a minute. It was over almost before it began. Someone got a lantern lit, and in its swinging light, Clara found herself on the floor, amid the wreckage, gripped hard against Ethan's roped chest, where he'd twisted to cover her. Even bound, even beaten, even now, the 2 of them tangled together on the dirty floor of a murderer's shack. Both of them alive, both of them whole, while Amos Hendricks's 3 big sons hauled a raving, weeping Silas Grady up off the ground and pinned his soft hands behind his back at last. "You're alive," Ethan kept saying, his split lip against her hair, his tied hands straining uselessly to hold her. "You came down that mountain, you walked into this, you're alive." "So are you," Clara wept, laughing, pressing her face to his bloody, beautiful, living face. "So are you, so are you, so are you. Somebody cut this man loose." Old Hendricks growled, and a knife flashed, and the ropes fell away, and then Ethan Walker's arms free. At last closed around Clara Bennett so hard she couldn't breathe, and she didn't want to breathe. She wanted to stay exactly there forever on the floor of a broken shack, in the arms of the man who did not know how to leave people, while the valley he'd saved stood guard around them in the lantern light. They took Silas Grady and his 5 men down to town under guard that same night, roped and marching, and old Hendricks sent his fastest son riding west at first light to Miller's Crossing and passed it with a second wire for Judge Amos Caro. This one did not ask him to come in September. This one asked him to come now, And Amos Caro, who had ridden a hard circuit for 30 years, and had never once in all that time received a wire that made his old blood run as hot as this one. Did a rich man, a stolen valley, a buried letter, an attempted murder witnessed by 14 sworn men and a schoolteacher wanted in Cheyenne, on a charge that smelled even at 100 miles distance, exactly like a rich man's son, hiding behind a poor woman's ruin. Judge Amos Caro read that wire and stood up from his desk and told his clerk to send to Cheyenne for the school's ledgers immediately by the fastest rider money could buy and to have his horse saddled. "We're going to Red Hollow," the old judge said, "tonight, and God have mercy on Silas Grady because I don't intend to." It took the ledgers 11 days to come up from Cheyenne. They were 11 days Clara spent up on the mountain, for the judge had heard even before he arrived enough to order her not arrested, but simply held to the valley in Ethan Walker's custody, pending the truth. And they were in their strange way 11 of the sweetest days of her life. Because Ethan mended. The swelling went down, and the split lip healed, and the color came back, and Ruth fussed over the both of them, and pretended she hadn't wept when they'd come up the mountain alive, and Ellie came and stayed, and Sarah came up the mountain too. At last. Ethan's sister, who stood in the doorway of her dead mother's house for the first time in 6 years, and looked at her brother, and looked at Clara, and burst into tears, and crossed the room, and took her brother in her arms, and forgave him without a single word needing to be said, because some things are past words, and a brother nearly dying in a creek to save a stranger who saved him back is a kind of answer to, "Where were you that needs no other?" And on the 12th day the ledgers came, and the whole valley crowded into the town's one meeting hall, and Judge Amos Caro opened them on the table before him, and put on his spectacles, and looked. He looked the way nobody in Cheyenne ever had. He read the entries in his slow, careful voice, and he laid the tuition strongbox ledger beside the school's account ledger, and he traced the figures with one blunt finger down the page, and the whole hall held its breath. And then the old judge looked up over his spectacles at Clara Bennett, standing pale and straight at the front of the room with Ethan Walker's hand gripping hers. "Miss Bennett," Judge Caro said, "this ledger shows the tuition money was withdrawn from the strongbox on the 14th of April at 3 in the afternoon and signed out, mind you, in a clear hand by one Robert Ashby, the schoolmaster's son, 2 days before you were ever accused." He removed his spectacles. "The money was never stolen at all, child. It was withdrawn in daylight with a signature by a young man who then spent it on debts of his own and let the blame fall on the hired teacher when his father came asking. It's here in his own hand. It's been here the whole time. All anyone ever had to do." The old judge's voice roughened with an anger 30 years on the bench had not worn smooth. "All anyone in Cheyenne ever had to do was open this book and look." The hall was silent. "You are innocent, Miss Bennett," Judge Amos Caro said. "You have always been innocent, and on the authority vested in me by this territory, I am striking the warrant against your name, and I am entering into the record tonight before this whole valley as witness that Clara Bennett of Cheyenne is guilty of no crime save being poor in a place that mistook poverty for wickedness. Your name is clear, child, fully and forever clear. And I am sorry as one honest man can be for the failures of others, that it took you a year and 400 miles and a walk down a mountain into a murderer's shack to find a single soul willing to open a book and read it." Clara Bennett stood in the crowded hall, and she did not cry. She had thought she would. She had imagined this moment in the worst nights of the worst year, imagined someone finally saying, "You are innocent," and had always thought she'd come apart when it came, but she didn't. She stood straight and level and clear-eyed, and she felt the year of running fall off her shoulders like a coat she'd carried too long, and she turned and looked at Ethan Walker, at the man who'd said, "I know enough before there was any reason to," who'd read her innocence off the grip of her own hand across 30 feet of laughing store, who'd known the truth of her a year before. A judge and a ledger caught up to it, and she found that the only thing she wanted to do with her cleared name and her free life was give them both of them to him. And Silas Grady, standing in irons at the side of the hall, awaiting his own reckoning, watched the whole valley he'd cheated turn its face toward the poor schoolteacher he'd laughed at, turn toward her with shame and with wonder, and with something that was starting slowly to look like love. And Silas Grady finally understood, far too late, the thing Clara had told him in the lamplit shack. That a person's worth is never measured by what they carry, but by what they are willing to give. Silas Grady's trial did not wait for September. Judge Amos Caro held it in that same meeting hall the following week, and he held it in the full light of day, with the doors thrown open, and the whole valley crowded in and spilling out onto the street, because the old judge said a crime committed in darkness for a year deserved to be answered in sunlight, where every soul who'd been wronged could watch the answering. And they came. They all came. Amos Hendricks stood up and swore to his stolen Southfield, and his 3 sons swore beside him. The widow Calloway stood up pale and ashamed and braver than Clara had ever imagined that pinched woman could be, and swore not only to the debt Silas had leaned on her to falsify, but to her own part in it, to the room she'd given away, and the lie she'd told, and she turned in the witness chair and looked straight at Clara Bennett in front of the whole valley, and said the words that no one had made her say. "I turned you into the street," the widow said, her voice shaking. "You came to my door tired and honest, and I turned you out and told a lie about you to cover it because Silas Grady frightened me and because it was easier than doing right. And I have not slept a whole night since. I don't ask you to forgive me, girl. I only ask this hall to hear me say I was wrong. I was wrong, and you were never anything but wronged, and I'll carry that till I die." And Clara Bennett, sitting between Ethan and old Ruth, felt something she had not expected to feel for the woman who'd put her in the street. She felt sorry for her, because Clara understood now in a way she never could have a year ago, that the widow's cruelty had been the cruelty of fear. And that fear was Silas Grady's real crop, the thing he'd truly farmed all these years. More than land, more than money. He'd grown a whole valley full of frightened people who did small wrong things to each other, because the alternative was to stand alone against him. And the moment one man had refused to be frightened, one lonely cowboy stepping out of a doorway, the whole rotten harvest had begun to fail. Then the boy took the stand. Danny Grady, Silas's own son. 14 years old, thin as a rail, and he walked to the witness chair past his father in irons and would not look at him. And he raised his hand and swore to tell the truth. And then he told it, all of it. Everything he'd carried, the buried letters and the false ledgers and the hidden mail and the whispered orders. And when Judge Caro asked him gently why after all this time he'd finally decided to speak, the boy's chin trembled, and he said, "Because of what she said." He looked at Clara. "In the street, that day. She said a person's worth ain't what they carry, it's what they're willing to give. And I've been carrying my pa's secrets my whole life, and I never gave anybody anything but lies, because that's all he ever taught me to give." The boy's voice cracked. "I don't want to be him, sir. I looked at him and I looked at her, and I don't want to be him. So I'm giving the truth. It's the only thing I've got that's mine to give." And in the irons at the side of the hall, Silas Grady put his soft face in his soft hands, and for the first time in his life, and far too late, Silas Grady wept. Not for himself, Clara thought, watching him, but because his own son had just chosen out loud in front of the whole world to be nothing like him. That was the twist none of them saw coming. Not the ledgers, not the confession, not the verdict. The boy, the son who broke the father, not with hatred, but by refusing to inherit him. Judge Amos Caro found Silas Grady guilty on every count. The fraud, the theft of land, the false warrant sworn against Clara, and the attempted murder of Ethan Walker, witnessed by 14 men. He sentenced him to the territorial prison for a term that would see him an old man before he walked free, if he ever did. And he ordered every acre of creek land Silas had stolen returned to the families he'd taken it from Hendricks's South Field and the widow's 40, and every small holding squeezed off in every hard winter restored by order of the court to the hands that had worked it. And then the old judge did one thing more. "There is the matter of Sarah Walker's land," Judge Caro said, reading from his notes. "Taken 6 years past in the same fraudulent manner from the defendant's brother-in-law." He looked up over his spectacles and found Sarah in the crowd. Sarah with Ellie's hand in hers, holding her breath. The husband is gone north and cannot be found, and the debt was run in his name. But the wrong was done to the family, And this court holds that a fraud is a fraud, whether the man who signed for it stays or runs." He set down his pen. "The land is restored to Sarah Walker and her daughter Eleanor, free and clear in their own names, where no husband and no creditor can ever take it from them again. Let it be entered so." Sarah Walker made a sound like she'd been struck and sank down, and Ellie caught her, and the whole hall erupted, and Ethan Walker beside Clara bowed his head and shook 6 years of guilt breaking apart all at once, because the land he'd failed to save when he was drowning in grief had come back to his sister at last. And this time he hadn't stood quiet. This time he'd been the reason. Clara took his hand. He gripped it like a drowning man grips a rope. "You did that," she whispered. "You hear me, Ethan? You got her land back, not the judge. You came down off your mountain and you wouldn't stand quiet, and it started everything, and it ended here with Sarah's name on her own land. It's done. Do you hear me? The debt you've been carrying for 6 years, it's paid. All of it. Look at your sister's face and know it's paid." And Ethan Walker lifted his head and looked at his sister weeping with joy over her restored land, and looked at his niece with her arms around her mother, and looked at Clara Bennett, gripping his hand, and Clara watched something leave his gray eyes that had been in them since the day she met him. The tiredness, the old bottomless grief, watched it lift and go like a fog burning off a mountain in the morning sun. "It's paid," he said hoarsely, like a man testing whether the words could be true. "It's paid," Clara said, and Ethan Walker began at last to believe it. They were married in the autumn when the aspens on the mountain had gone to gold. Reverend Pryor performed it stronger now than he'd been in years, the valley said, as if watching justice done had put fresh life in the old man's bones, and he performed it in the mountain garden. The garden Clara had brought back from the dead, standing among the very herb beds she'd cleared with her own blistered hands on those first cold mornings. Ruth wept openly and pretended it was the wind. Sarah stood as Clara's witness, having become over that long, healing autumn the sister Clara had never had. And Ellie carried the flowers, wild mountain flowers, and sprigs of the rosemary that had somehow survived 6 winters of neglect, the rosemary that had refused to die, which Clara thought was exactly right. Ethan Walker stood before the Reverend in a clean white shirt with his hat in his hands, and he looked at Clara Bennett coming toward him through his mother's garden, and this quiet man who did not fill silence, who spoke rarely and meant everything he said, found he could not say a single word. So Clara said them first. "You want to know why I'm marrying you, Ethan Walker?" she said softly, taking his rough hands in both of hers, before the Reverend and God and the whole assembled valley. "It's the same reason I stayed. A year ago, I was a woman the world had decided to throw away. I had 2 pennies and a torn bag and my father's necklace, and every soul I met looked at me and saw a problem. And then a man stepped out of a doorway and said 3 words. I know enough." Her voice trembled, and she let it. "You knew enough. When nobody else would even look, you knew enough. You've spent your whole life thinking your worth was in what you failed to save your father, your mother, your sister. But I'm going to spend the rest of mine showing you the truth. Your worth is in what you give Ethan. And you gave a thrown-away stranger her dignity back before you knew one thing about her. You gave this whole valley its courage back. You gave me a home when I had none, and a name I could keep, and a table with more than one plate at it." She lifted his hands and pressed them to her heart. "So that's why I'm marrying you. Because a person's worth is never what they carry. It's what they're willing to give. And you, Ethan Walker, gave everything. To everyone. And it's about time somebody gave it all back to you." And Ethan Walker finally found his words. "I had 5 empty chairs at my table for 6 years, he said, his voice breaking on every word, tears standing in his gray eyes, and not one bit of shame in them now. And I told myself that was the price. That I'd failed the people I loved, and the sentence was to sit alone in a house full of ghosts, and never let anybody close, because letting them close meant I might fail them too." He drew a shaking breath. "And then you sat down in one of those chairs, Clara, with 2 pennies and a spine of iron, and a way of meddling in a man's family that ought to be against the law. A wet laugh broke out of him, and out of the whole watching valley. And you wouldn't get up, and you wouldn't let me stand quiet, and you wouldn't let me carry my ghosts 1 more mile. You walked down a mountain into a murderer's shack, and put your own body over mine, because you would not leave me, and I have never in my whole life been loved like that, and I didn't know a man could be. He lifted her hands and pressed them to his own heart, mirroring her. So here's my vow, and it's the only one I've got. I stood quiet my whole life, and it cost me everything. I will never stand quiet again where you're concerned. Not for 1 day. Every morning of my life, I'm going to step out of that doorway for you the way I did that first morning, over and over till I'm too old to stand. Because you're the thing I finally got brave enough to fight for, and I aim to keep on fighting for you every day I've got left. Reverend Pryor, wiping his own eyes, pronounced them man and wife. And Ethan Walker kissed his bride in his mother's garden, under the gold aspens, and the whole valley of Red Hollow. The valley that had once laughed at a hungry woman in a store rose up and cheered until the mountains rang. A year is a long time, and a short one. A year after the wedding, 2 years near enough after a torn-bagged woman with 2 pennies had walked into Grady's general store and been laughed out of it, the mountain ranch that had been a house full of ghosts had become the most talked-about place in the whole territory. They called it Walker's Mountain now. Or sometimes more often they called it the Herb Farm, because that was what it had grown into. Clara had done exactly what she'd promised, standing in that dusty kitchen with a leather book in her hands. She'd learned every recipe in Ethan's mother's book, every tincture and poultice and fever remedy, generations of a family's healing knowledge brought back from a cedar trunk. And the garden had grown to fill the whole flat below the barn, and spilled past it rows on rows of medicinals, and people came from 3 days' ride in every direction, the way they'd once come to Ethan's mother for the fever syrup, for the wound poultice, for the cough remedy. Ethan still ground the cherry bark for himself, standing at the counter where his mother had once let him lick the honey spoon. And here was the thing the whole valley marveled at, the thing that made the old women shake their heads in wonder. The people who once laughed at Clara Bennett now traveled miles to buy from her. The very townsfolk who'd stood in Silas Grady's store and found joy in kicking a woman who was down, they came up the mountain, now hats in their hands, and asked politely at the door of the woman they'd mocked, and she sold to them fair and kind, and turned none of them away, because Clara Bennett had learned in the hardest school, there is what it costs to be turned away, and she'd sworn she'd never do it to another living soul. Widow Calloway came up most often. She and Clara had made over that long healing year an unlikely and genuine peace, the older woman helping in the garden, learning the recipes herself now, so that when Clara couldn't fill an order, the widow could. The two of them working the herb beds side by side, the woman who'd put Clara in the street, and the woman she'd put there growing medicine together in the mountain sun. Some things Clara had come to believe healed better than they'd ever broken. Danny Grady lived with the Reverend, now learning his letters properly in Clara's own schoolroom, learning a different way to be a man than his father had taught him. The boy had a gift for the growing things, it turned out, and spent his free afternoons up at the herb farm with his hands in the good black earth, and Ethan, who might have hated the son of the man who'd tried to drown him, had instead taken the boy under his wing, taught him to ride and mend fence, and set a straight post, because Ethan Walker understood better than anyone alive that a person is not the sum of what was done to make them, but of what they choose to give after. Sarah and Ellie lived on their own restored land down the valley, in their own names, where no man could ever take it from them. But they came up the mountain most Sundays, and the house that had held 5 empty chairs for 6 years now could not fit everyone who wanted a seat at the table. Ethan and Clara and Ruth Sarah and Ellie, the Reverend. When his old bones allowed the ride, Danny with dirt under his fingernails, the widow Calloway with a fresh loaf. The great table built for 6 that Ethan had eaten alone at for 6 years with 1 plate and 1 cup was crowded now every Sunday, with laughter and argument and the good clatter of a full house, and every single Sunday, without fail, Ethan Walker looked down that crowded table and had to get up and step outside for a minute, because the fullness of it still undid him. And the mountain that had once been Ethan Walker's prison. The lonely height he'd climbed to punish himself, the place that had meant nothing but grief and ghosts and silence for 6 long years. The mountain meant home now. It meant the garden green to its edges, and the herb beds fragrant in the sun, and the good black earth giving back 100-fold what was put in. It meant a schoolroom full of the valley's children learning their letters, and a farm full of medicine that healed the sick, and a table full of family every Sunday. It meant Ruth in the kitchen, and Ellie in the garden, and Danny at the fence, and Sarah's laugh across the yard. It meant a lonely man who'd learned late but true that the bravest thing a person can do is refuse to stand quiet, and a thrown-away woman who'd learned that the truth given long enough, and one honest witness will finally come into the sunlight. Most of all, it meant the two of them. Ethan and Clara Walker, sitting out on the porch in the long gold evenings. After the day's work was done, the way they'd sat that first evening with the herb book by lamplight before the riders came up the track. But no riders came up the track anymore. No lies came hunting up the mountain in the dark. There was only the two of them and the evening and the garden they'd brought back from the dead together. One such evening, near 2 years to the day since she'd walked into that store, Clara sat on the porch with her head on her husband's shoulder and her father's silver necklace at her throat. She wore it every day. Now the necklace Silas Grady had called worthless. The necklace she'd nearly had to sell for bread, and she watched the last light go gold over the valley that had once thrown her away, and she thought about how far it had all come from that torn bag and those 2 pennies. "You know what I keep thinking," she said softly. Ethan's arm tightened around her. "Tell me, that old fool Silas was right about one thing." She turned the necklace between her fingers the way her father had, the way she'd held it through the whole laughing store the day they met. "The silver in this really isn't worth much. He wasn't wrong about that." She smiled up at her husband. "But he never understood what my father understood. That it was never about the silver. It was about what it meant. My father gave me this the night before he died, and he said it was worth more than anything he could leave me, and I didn't understand him. Then I was too young. But I understand him now." Her eyes were bright. "Because the thing that saved my life wasn't worth much either, Ethan. It was 2 pennies and a torn bag and a woman too stubborn to sell her dignity. That's all I carried into this valley. Nothing. And it turned out nothing was exactly enough, because there was one man in the whole territory who understood that a person's worth was never what they carried." Ethan Walker was quiet for a long moment, the way he always was before he said a thing he meant. Then he took her hand, the one holding the necklace, and folded both of his rough hands around it. "My mother used to say, a body tells the truth with its whole self," he said. "Its hands, the set of its shoulders, the way it holds on to a thing that matters." He looked at her hand wrapped around the silver. "I told you that the first day. Told you it was how I knew you weren't lying. You held that necklace through the whole thing and never once let it go, never once sold it cheap to make them stop." His gray eyes found hers in the gold light. "I've had a lot of time to think on it since, and I figured out what I really saw that day. It wasn't just that you were telling the truth, Clara. It was that you already knew young as you were thrown away. As you were, you already knew the thing it took me 38 years and losing everything to learn." His voice roughened. "You knew what was worth holding on to, and you held on, through all of it. You held on to your dignity when they laughed, and you held on to the truth when nobody'd look, and you held on to me on the floor of that shack when running would have saved your life." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to it. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Clara Walker, and the world tried to throw you away. And instead, you're the one who taught a whole valley what it had forgotten." Clara Walker looked at her husband in the last of the golden light on the porch of the home they'd built out of ruin above the garden they'd raised from the dead, and she knew with a certainty that went all the way to the bone that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The woman nobody wanted had become the woman a whole valley traveled miles to reach. The stranger thrown into the summer dust had become the heart of a mountain that would hold her and her family all the days of her life. And the lonely cowboy who'd sat alone at a table set for 6, who'd been so sure his worth was measured only by what he'd failed to save, had learned at last the truth his mother knew and his wife had taught him, and the whole valley now understood, that a person's worth is never measured by what they carry, but by what they are willing to give. And these two, who had once had nothing, who had once been thrown away, who had once sat alone in the dark, had given each other everything. And it had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been a home.